Mandeep, I'll give you the final word here. 60 seconds. Talk to us about just the valuation on TikTok itself.
Yeah, so when we look at the overall revenue, it's closer to 16 to 20 billion, and US is probably half of their revenue. And when you use the current social media multiples, we arrived at a $40 to $50 billion valuation. It's somewhat for the fastest growing social media asset because of all the regulatory concerns. And look, with this consumer internet apps, they're worth zero if you lose engagement. And that's the risk with TikTok. If it gets banned to a potential buyer, once the users move away out of the platform, it's not worth anything. And I think that's where you have to put a discount. And we arrived at that $40 to $50 billion valuation for a willing buyer, which could be Oracle, Microsoft, or a consortium of private equity based on our expectations.
Okay, thank you both. Thank you both for your time. A really good conversation. Lindsay Gorman of the German Marshall Fund and Mandeep Singh of Bloomberg Intelligence. Thank you both for joining us. As we were having that conversation, further developments on the banking story. We've been talking all morning about how we see weakness in European banking, and once again that is weighing on the European stock story. Let's focus in on what we're seeing there, because Deutsche Bank certainly to the forefront here. It is the worst performing of these banks this morning. Deutsche Bank down by 11.1%, as you can see, intraday. What is driving this? Well, some of our colleagues linking the moves we're seeing in CDS here and suggesting we've seen a spike up in CDS. Deutsche Bank shares slumping as CDS jumps, and this is the cost of insuring against default over at Deutsche Bank. As we head into the weekend, a sense that investors are trying to de-risk portfolios perhaps, and wary of what can happen over weekends, as we've seen over recent ones. And we're seeing this in FX markets as well. So the dollar is gaining, the euro is losing ground, the yen is gaining, the pound is losing ground. So we're pretty risk off this morning as we look to hand over to the United States. This is Bloomberg.
Hello.
Commercials on there. Absolutely. It'll be nothing.
And check one down. Okay, good. That is real.
A dream of spinning golf tonight, and then tomorrow, walking down the street, and they're like, "Oh, here's something walking down the parkway," and all of a sudden the billboard to my right has the doctor on it, advertising, who knows what. Because we're going to do right now.
I can even tell the difference. But that's probably cool for her.
We're investing a lot in a lot of capabilities and features that makes the in-store shopping experience that much easier, that much more compelling.
Damn, bitch.
Price check, browsing inventory in the store, so that we can really make that experience as convenient and as simple as possible.
Convenient, simple. That's sort of what people have needed in the age of COVID. Is that here to stay, or do we go back when finally we all hope that the pandemic will be behind us in some way? Do our changing shopping habits go back again?
What's really
That fucking
interesting
thing
about
is good.
retail in my 20-plus experience is that convenience never reverts itself. Now, the form of convenience has shifted, whereas, say, in 2000, 2010, a lot of convenience was driven by more stores nearby. Now it's stores in addition to digital. There's nothing closer than the phone in your hand.
And we went right into a commercial for the Coast to Coast AM iPhone app. I thought that was rather funny. It's all about fun. How would we operate in the center? It's just thinking in that, I just mentioned earlier, and there's one or two breaks so you can see a screen But the implanting, it's all done. It's hard to communicate created it and perfected in a number of ways. First, you have to learn
Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. A real focus on de-risking, it seems, here in Europe. Deutsche Bank extending its drop. That's dropped down 11.1%. British e-commerce bank also down 8%. SocGen over in France down by 6.5%. Colleagues talking about businesses that are exposed to corporate lending here being in the focus.
Yeah, you're seeing it in the stock, you're seeing it in the credit default swap, specifically the 5-year surging there, and in the FX space, a read through into the macro as well. The euro at a 107 handle, weakening as we speak.
Yeah, and some of these European equity markets now down by more than 2%. The CAC 40 down by 2%. The Central DAX in Germany down by just shy of that amount as we work our way towards the start of US trading. That is it for early editions. Surveillance is ahead. This is Big Break.
Over top of it, so nobody can see that it's there. Don't have to charge it with a swipe. Just letting it to
Chris, can I ask my landlord for a rent cut within the next couple months? Like, is that reasonable?
Well, I guess it depends when you sign your lease. It sounds like you saw kind of one of those pandemic deals that, particularly in New York City, where rents actually fell really sharply in that first year of the pandemic. So we are really seeing the market having turned a corner a little bit over these past few months. Prices have been coming down for 4 straight months now in our national rent index. But if you're still paying that late 2020 level, then you might not necessarily eligible for a discount at this point.
All right, I have another question, which is like, so I have 2 kids, but unlike other people, I actually am cool and I don't want to move to the suburbs.
This episode is just Joe taking advice on handling his rent.
I just want to point out I really like my landlord.
You love your landlord?
She's very attentive. We have a very good relationship. So even though I started the episode saying I was anxious, if she is listening to this, I hope she hears that I really enjoy where we live and I really enjoy our
She should factor your consistency into her pricing algorithm. Excellent.
Live 6 to 9 a.m. on JFI and on demand anytime on the iHeartRadio app.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
Inflation is sticky. The Fed has to do something. Its credibility is still on the line.
We don't think that there is a material risk of broad-based challenges. Instead, we've been calling for this bumpy landing.
What matters and what actually shocks my economic and inflation model is how fast they cut and when they start cutting.
The market has anticipated a lot of rate cuts this year. Our economist still thinks it's off in the future.
The Fed is going to be on hold until inflation gets down to something much closer to 2%, and that's, I think, going to take a while.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrell, and Lisa Abramowitz.
I've forgotten what day it is. Totally. It's like every single morning.
Next week.
It's Sunday evening. Cliff Edge. Never ending. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning. Good morning for our audience worldwide. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Reliably informed. It's Friday. Almost getting into the weekend. Equity futures down about about 0.75%. Some European banking names struggling to get to the weekend here. Deutsche Bank, Lisa, down 12% over in German trading. UBS is down about 6%. No drama relative to the action we've seen over the last, say, 2 weeks or so. 6% is kind of like unchanged relative to what we have witnessed, but still pretty dicey stuff for some of these names.
Especially because it's not just in the stock price, you're also seeing this in the credit default swaps, what people are charging to insure against a potential default surging for Deutsche Bank in particular. At what point does this indicate that we're not out of the woods? And I think that this is a larger concern. There have been all of these officials coming out saying all is clear, the banking system is sound and resilient, and yet still those jitters are being reflected in market prices.
Stephanie Yellen, I think it was her 50th appearance in like 2 days.
Yes.
Finding a new way, a different way to say the same thing. You know, that's been the last couple of weeks for her. I felt really bad for the Treasury Secretary over the last couple of weeks. Almost left to sort of hang out to dry, lamb for slaughter in the eyes of an administration that we haven't really heard much from, apart from a statement after Sunday evening.
I would completely agree because there are certain things that are not in her purview. She cannot do single-handedly, and it was very clear from the hearings in the House yesterday that a lot of the politicians were not interested in talking about deposit insurance. They weren't talking about long-standing solutions. They still wanted to talk about the budget and the debt ceiling and all these other issues. So without their political will, how much can she say? She did amend her statement, though. She made this change. She added, certainly we would be prepared to take additional actions if warranted. It didn't work, though.
No, of course not. What does that mean? It's the same thing she said all over again and again and again.
What else can she say?
Nothing.
But that's the issue, right?
But she's in front of the individuals that can make legislation to change.
Correct.
The cap. That doesn't make sense to me. So why are we criticising the Treasury Secretary when the individuals who are questioning her are the ones that should be making legislation?
I couldn't agree more, especially because had she come out and said, what we need right now is full deposit backstops, you guys have to get on board with that, that would absolutely cause panic in markets. Why is suddenly this needed? Why is she lobbying so hard for this at a time when people are saying it's safe and sound? It's, damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Let's get into the weekend. The price action looks like this on the S&P 500, down about 0.7%. Let's call it down 0.6% on the S&P 500. Still poised for a second week of gains. Yes, really, 2 weeks of banking turmoil and poised for a second week of gains on the S&P 500. Yields are down aggressively by 12 basis points, 3.30 on a US 10-year. The 2-year yield is down another 20 basis points on the 2-year. The 2-year right now, 3.62. That's basically near the lows of the week, 362.83. In fact, that takes out the lows of the week, Lisa. Just remarkable stuff to see the 2-year down here. Briefly, 3.61. So yesterday we were down 10 basis points. The day before that we were down 23 basis points. We're dropping pretty aggressively this morning.
And when you take a look at what people are expecting in terms of rate cuts, they're now pricing in 120 basis points, 1.2 percentage points of cuts through the end of January next year. So it just shows you how much the scenario has changed. We have been asking all week, when does the economic data matter? And we continue to say it's all backward looking, at least until it's not. And right now we are going to get some economic data and people will tell you why it doesn't matter. However, I am going to be interested to see what the U.S. durable goods orders are. That comes out at 8:30 a.m. And what you saw building on what we saw over in Europe was ongoing strain in the goods sector, disinflation there, and ongoing upside surprises in the inflation and activity on the services. How much do we continue to see this? Do we start to see some softening in terms of the durable goods orders, and do we start to see some recovery at a time when perhaps rates are going down? It's just a jumble, but it is relevant. 9:30 a.m. We hear from St. Louis Fed President James Bullard. Over to you. Did something break? We're looking at that 2-year yield and the round trip, the fact that now they're the lowest going back to September of last year. Has something shifted materially that Fed officials can point to and say, hey, markets, we got you, we see you, we understand what you're saying, and we will reflect that? Or are they going to continue to try to push back, I would say, and argue potentially to no avail? Today, bids are due for the Silicon Valley Bank, either in its entirety or in parts. Evidently, there is some deal with Customers Bank Corp that's being discussed for some or part of some or all of the bank. The fact that the FDIC pushed back the bids, they're due today, and they had originally been due, I believe, last week. The fact that they did that has raised some questions. Does nobody want a bid? Did they want a better bid? Do they want more time to look under the hood to understand what the liabilities were that they were taking on? I think that's going to be interesting to parse out.
Really?
Do they like the people?
No, we didn't. We didn't get it.
You'd raise that question
I
too.
think we didn't
Sure,
get it.
I'll
Where
raise
the bids are coming from?
whether they wanted to
And
be
then
a
it's
big
like
bank, whether
more
they wanted to be
cowbell.
another kind of
And then
local,
precisely.
we were like, I don't get it.
consolidation
Uncle
of
Tommy,
the
what is it?
middle
It's like,
class.
oh, it's like we need more
Well,
cowbell.
yes,
It's like,
that's another thing, right? They don't want that to be the case because they want it to look good and feel good, and regionals getting together.
Look good and feel good. What is this therapy? You know,
It's Friday after a long week. Let's talk about our feelings.
I feel for Secretary Yellen in a big way. She found a new way to say the same thing. Take a listen.
why can't I search by gift?
We've used important tools to act quickly to prevent contagion, and they are tools we would use again. The strong actions we've taken ensure that Americans' deposits are safe. Certainly, we would be prepared to take additional actions if warranted.
That's a new line. I'm not sure how different it is. Chris Marangi joins us now, co-CIO at Gabelli Funds. Chris, your words, the bank crisis, a feature, not a bug of Fed policy. Chris, what do you mean by that?
Well, listen, I think we've talked for a long time about Chair Powell pushing rates until something breaks, and clearly something is broken. He's made no, he hasn't been shy about talking about the fact that this credit crisis is going to be disinflationary. It helps them attack inflation. So as long as we can manage through this, it probably helps that part of the equation.
If we can manage through it, if we can avoid a deeper crisis, one that spreads even more, Chris, is this sector attractive to you in any way, shape, or form?
Well, thankfully, we have generally avoided cyclical we've generally avoided commoditized businesses, and the borrow short, lend long business is somewhat commoditized. And
Yo, should be like, dog.
it's become less
Yeah,
attractive
oh, dog, these
recently,
things sucks.
in part because funding costs are going to go up. Banks are going to have to pay more for deposits. Credit quality is likely deteriorating. There will be fewer loans, or fewer revenue opportunities, and almost certainly more regulation, including higher credit standards, higher ratios required. And that's going to impact both the P and the E for these
I'll give
stocks.
you the P and E go. What does that even mean?
Not something I want to get involved with today.
I feel like this market's been exerting the maximal pain on the maximal number of traders at all times. Heading into this year, people were talking about value stocks and how banks fit into that, and how big tech was going to be left for dead. Big tech is ripped. Banks are having trouble. At this point, do you still think that big tech can lead, given the concerns around growth, given the concerns that perhaps the cost cutting and the potential right sizing of the businesses is not over?
Yeah, I would make a distinction about, obviously there's been this rotation back to tech, back to growth. I think much of that is related to the safe haven trade. Investors looking for these big nation state type companies with big credit balances, cash flowing businesses. And so tech, profitless tech, has not shared in as much in this rotation, and a higher interest rate environment, a recessionary environment, is not going to be good for those companies. So we're still looking for the cash flow generators, companies with pricing power, and that's been the formula for recessionary environment, for an inflationary environment.
We started this conversation, Chris, talking about the Fed hiking rates until something breaks, and something clearly has broken, as you said. I'm curious what that means about the way you invest, in terms of, do you go for diversification, or do you go for further concentration in the companies that you know best?
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously looking for diversification across both industries and companies, but it's, to a certain extent, we want to focus on our core competencies. We want to put our eggs in a basket and watch that basket, and that's basically what we've been doing unchanged for 40 years.
Chris, are we sleepwalking into a crisis, a much bigger one?
I don't think, I'm certainly not sleepwalking. I don't think the market is as well. The market is well aware of what's going on, and maybe a little bit too nervous, given the recency for many of us of the 07-08 crisis. Obviously, lots of risks out there, and that's what we get paid to manage.
Do you think that breeds complacency, though? Those that experienced 07-08 always sit there and say it's not 07-08, Chris.
It's always a little bit different, and clearly this time is different. I don't think we have quite the systemic issues in the banking system that we did back then. Obviously, the Fed now, having raised rates so aggressively, does have some ammunition, some dry powder to obviously cut rates and improve the situation. But it's what you don't know that you worry about.
Totally, and there's so much we don't know. Chris, we've got to leave it there. Thank you, sir. Chris Marangi there, Left Valley Funds. Lisa, there's tons we don't know still.
The issue that I've been taking with a lot of people are saying is this is a liquidity issue, not a credit issue. Well, liquidity issues always lead to credit issues if they're long enough. I mean, this is the issue. It happened back in 2007 with the commercial paper market, back in the asset-backed commercial paper market in Canada, that sort of, some people argue, triggered all of the subsequent events. So at what point are we looking at some seizure in lending that creates the credit problems that aren't being priced into the market? I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I just take issue with people who are trying to draw too clean of a distinction here, because the two are deeply interrelated.
Blaming Canada this morning. It's new. That's good. It's waking up in America. Could have bad that.
Well, I mean, look.
Grandma's blaming Canada.
Well, I mean, that's where Joe Biden is. So I guess, look, I'm not blaming Canada. Just to be very clear. Come on.
I just winding you up. I know it's hard from a long week. Mike Gavin of Bank of America, downside risk to spending could grow if the banking sector stress causes a sharp tightening of lending standards. That's his line in his research in the last 24 hours. Lisa, I think that speaks precisely to what you're talking about.
Yeah, this is going to be the issue, and this is the reason why people say that no matter what happens, there's going to be more distress. Is it being priced in? I don't know, because if rates go lower and people have priced, the parameters of uncertainty are great. It's just that drawing a distinction between liquidity and credit issues, difficult for me to stomach, given the fact that those are two so interrelated.
Given a few more days, those treasuries on those banks' balance sheets won't be underwater anymore. So your yield's running so hard, down 25 basis points.
The second that they are underwater again, let's start the whole narrative over again, and we're back to runaway inflation.
Can we talk about the TikTok CEO later?
Yes, please.
What a slick dude. Seriously, how polished.
Except, when they asked him, is this spying? And he's like, I wouldn't call it spying. It's
Sure,
looking at
but
the
you
whole
know,
thing, which is like,
just to picture the scene. Everyone hates you. They're all throwing aggressive questions at you. I thought he dealt with them very well. And then we can talk about what it ultimately means for the company, because I don't think he helped the company at all. But
he looks good.
It's a pretty slick dude.
TikTok.
Next hour, Trogarsky is going to be joining us from FS Investments.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world. With the first word, I'm Lisa Mateo. U.S. prosecutors have charged Terraform Labs co-founder Do Kwon with orchestrating a massive cryptocurrency fraud. It's said to have wiped out at least $40 billion in market value. Kwon was already a fugitive from charges in his native South Korea. He was arrested Thursday in Montenegro. In Japan, inflation slowed for the first time in more than a year. Consumer prices, excluding fresh food, rose 3.1% in February from a year ago, down more than a full percentage point. But without the impact of government subsidies for energy and travel, inflation would have been as high as 4.4%. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says regulators are prepared to take more steps if needed to protect the banking system. Those comments to Congress came a day after her remarks on nationwide deposit insurance that rattled markets. On Wednesday, Yellen said officials hadn't considered the possibility of expanding federal insurance temporarily to U.S. bank deposits. And China is urging Europe to play a role in supporting peace talks for Russia's war in Ukraine. That's despite the U.S. warning that Beijing's proposals would effectively freeze the Kremlin's territorial gates. China's top diplomat spoke to a French official about the peace plan not long after Xi Jinping wrapped up meeting with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
Not even being cognizant of it. What's the difference point? This is customers. We're going to say, we're going to do without cash, we're going to do without credit cards, we're going to have none of that. All you're going to have is a little tiny chip in the palm of your hand.
Yoshi, you got your pizza now? Pizza dog. Oh, Yoshi. I like when all the crust from like a week before is all stuck on it. Here, done? Hey, the dog, are you done?
In the book about prepping, and how not to build a bomb shelter in your backyard.
PSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit pso.org/now, where the music plays on. PSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
Access the financial world on demand.
Hey, breakaway civilization. Hey, breakaway civilization.
Policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com.
Webinars. Oh, now they were talking about breakaway civilization, about sitting in his underwear eating bird pizza. He was like the last motherfucker on the Titanic. Wait for me. Are you done?
News breaks. No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
We've never seen anything like it. This was a decision that maybe was the best out of 3 very bad decisions, but it could prove to be a mistake.
She opposed Powell's renomination. She called him a dangerous man in 2021, and now she is really pointing the blame at the Fed.
Expecting the chicken here in Brussels today. This is a meeting that happens regularly, but obviously today it will be all about the banks.
Your global business authority.
I hope with you, and I think there's some questions around business models around the world. I had the issues like those.
Yoda. You actually, oh, dog, Megan. Megan was on here. Oh, dog. This is so sick.
That's what everyone hopes, right? That was Bill Winters there, the Standard Chartered CEO. UBS is down 7% today. The latest story here at Bloomberg is there might be a DOJ probe into Credit Suisse, UBS, and some other names as well. Police are associated with helping Russian oligarchs evade sanctions. Now, on Sunday evening, you and I and the whole team were talking about this government guarantee.
Pride is like man's worst, and that's what got the devil kicked out of hell, or kicked out of heaven, and everyone keeps trying to play God. It seems like
sometimes you inherit legal problems when you make an acquisition like this, and maybe one has already proven.
That was the speculation under the hood in terms of what took so long for UBS to sign off. What took so long, I should say, is days and hours rather than weeks and weeks. But the question really being, why do they demand such incredible concessions from the Swiss government unless they saw something under the hood that they didn't like?
That's something about
what happened.
I'm just going to have to fucking money.
Biggest shareholder groups wank it.
What? Oh, I'm going to die.
Oh, this Swiss rival
Yeah,
this week,
I'm
Vincent
letting you allow me to hand on your shoulder. Yeah,
following.
that's what
This
it's for.
situation is a big failure of corporate governance and may send a poor image of Switzerland for international institutional investors in terms of good governance. Vincent, I'm pleased to say, joins us right now. Vincent, fantastic to catch up with you, sir. I guess the first question is, how much room do you think you have for legal action here?
Very small. Actually, very small. In Switzerland, we don't know the concept of class action that doesn't exist in our law. Mismanagement, it's very difficult. We could never use this in the UBS case, or even the collapse of Switzerland in the years back 2000, when there was clearly mismanagement. So either against former executives of Credit Suisse or the decision of the firm, still there is really little to be done. Still
What's
looking
in
at
a
options
question?
the end of this week, after having discussions with many people, we don't see many options. We will still recommend at the next general meeting of Credit Suisse not to grant the discharge to the board, to keep all options open. If anything is revealed afterwards, as you said, there is a lot of still uncertainty, so we really recommend shareholders not to grant discharge to the board of directors of Credit Suisse.
Hard to make counterfactuals, sir, but just to cut in, what do you think would have happened Monday morning if this deal wasn't made?
We will never know. We will never know, but I trust the Swiss government that they reached this decision as they were aware of things that we didn't know. So I could clearly expect the similar crisis as in 2008. I would have expected the Lehman Brothers case and then the start of the liquidity crisis. So is this just a postponement, or can we manage to avoid this? Still to be seen, but yeah, obviously, if the government acted this way, they knew things which I still have belief and trust in our government that they reach a good decision.
Do you have any reason to suspect that you were not given accurate information about the condition the bank was in over the last couple of weeks?
I mean, we have the latest information we had is the financial year and 2022. The annual report had just been released, so we already had the interim financial Q4 result. But as you know, the full report was postponed by 1 week following SEC request. So the report was really quite quiet, saying it's nothing material, it's just reclass and so on. Still then the auditor and the management said about material weaknesses. So we only had the information of financial year and on Tuesday, I think. But I think the situation collapsed during the first quarter. So we don't really have any further information about the outflows. We know that about 10 million per day from the statement of the Saudi National Bank on the Wednesday. So obviously there was big outflows, but we will never know. I think we will never have the clear figures that the government had on Saturday.
Vincent, I'm curious from your perspective, given that you do talk to other shareholders, you represent them, what this does to Swiss companies going forward in terms of their credibility, the risk premia that people want to bake in to whatever they own from Switzerland.
Whoa.
Yeah, I think it's we have made big progress, I would say, in terms of corporate governance in Switzerland, typically on shareholder rights. We have a lot of rights. We are advancing also in terms of sustainability. So I think we were on a good move, and the fact that the government now decided that shareholders will not have any say on this, that also the antitrust authorities will have no say on this. I think it's quite dangerous for the future. I hope it doesn't create a precedent that the government is overusing this power. So we will be very looking at this precisely in the future. So obviously, when you remove such important rights to shareholders, you need to have good reason, very good reason. Otherwise, it's quite catastrophic in terms of governance.
So far,
I'm not sure it's seen already the corporate world, those kind of decisions.
Right, Vincent, and I want to pick up on what you said, which is if this happens again, if this sets a precedent, then there could be consequences. Have you already talked with shareholders? Have you already talked with investors who are removing some of their funds from certain Swiss shares just because of the uncertainty, because there potentially could be better options elsewhere?
No, honestly, no. I didn't hear anything on this one from international investors. I think many investors are still quite passive investors, so replicating indices. So that's still the main part. So as long as we have a large cap being part of those indices, I think international investors will always have those exposure. And we have wonderful, actually, industries and companies in Switzerland being leaders of their market. So in terms of mid and small cap, we have such a wonderful corporate field. But I think we need to ensure that the governance of those companies remain at the highest level, because of course all investors now are looking at those environmental, social, and governance. I think governance is coming back at the front of the scene. We were talking about environmental issues, very important, but you need to have a strong governance basis, and those failures, being in the US, being in Switzerland now, demonstrate that governance maybe was underlooked by investors. So for us, it's key that the governance mechanism works, that shareholders' rights are preserved for the future.
Vincent, thanks for joining us today. Vincent Kaufman there of Ethos Shareholder Group, representing shareholders of Credit Suisse. A difficult week, long week for him. Anyway, no shareholder vote. The Swiss came in. You saw the complaints, like that quote we talked about earlier this week. What's the difference between Switzerland and other jurisdictions where you don't trust the rule of law, just like that? Changed it over the weekend.
So one of the big questions has been the consequences of this, long-standing consequences of this. And Vincent basically suggested that so far people aren't willing to wholesale abandon Swiss holdings as a result of this particular ruling. That said, there have been a number of articles about Middle Eastern investors. This had been their first full significant foray back into the banking system since 2008, when they made this capital infusion into Credit Suisse. Now, perhaps not as interested in investing in some of the banking stocks around the world. So again, you wonder, there have to be consequences, whether it's the contingent capital market or whether there's something much broader that really makes people rethink where they put their money.
Let's talk about policy consequences right now. 2-year yield down 22 basis points. We priced it in a cut by June now. Is that the latest?
That is the latest.
By June.
Yep, and people are looking at that just to be the beginning of a series of cuts. It's not only one cut, it is a rate cutting cycle that we are now pricing in.
There you go. Market's saying you're done. Screaming you're done. And you're going to start cutting interest rates.
Market's screaming you're done. And by the way, maybe you made a mistake, Jay Powell. I mean, that's been sort of the latest that we're hearing in the mood this morning. You know, perhaps you shouldn't have raised rates at all. I think it's really tricky. I think that he was going to be blamed no matter what he did. And I think that he did. He towed the line very nicely. Just uncertain right now.
History will judge whether that move this week was cliche or vulgar. You know, it'll either look really foolish in months to come, or it will look like it was the right thing to do, and that's why those kind of decisions are impossible to make. It's a super hard decision. Futures down 7 tenths of 1% from New York. This is Bloomberg.
You ready to get banned? Yeah, remember that one guy like, oh, dude, here's my fucking essay, I'm like, you should get banned. That one guy, cool as fuck. Double dragon. Yeah. You told it. That was the Mario. Look at this Zoom. Look at this Zoom. Matthew, you're so sick. I know. I don't remember this one. What in the fuck? Yo. It goes feelings. Oh no, it goes in a little hole. That was baller as fuck. They said, oh, you think you're gonna go in the fan? Psych. There's a big psych, it's a battery reader. And then you think this battery reader is going to be cool, and then it's like a crazy ass battery reader. Like, you can zoom in on this motherfucking light. And then it was like, oh, dog, look at these jets and flying around here. This fucking robot. Psych. You think this is fucking code? These are motherfuckers at a computer who are coding. Really? And you can see everything every motherfucker wants to do. Look at this robot over here. Like, hey, Tim, look at my fucking desktop. Yo, dog. Yo, dog, want to see my home? Oh, you want to come inside that door? How about a little keyhole? You want some keyhole action? Look at this. Look at this keyhole action. Zooming like a motherfucker. Zooming like a motherfucker. Studying like my daddy. Zooming like my... Look at this. It's like, oh, dog, look at Wasteland here. This fucking looks like... Really? That one part did, but this cannot. It's not. It's almost as nice. Really? Yeah, look at this motherfucker. It's like, oh, dog, cyberpunk, dog. Yo, dog. Look at all this fucking shit, dog. Look at, you can read all this shit. You want to just send a Bassett. Just send a Bassett. Yes, send a Bassett. Just send a Bassett. I don't remember shit until somebody says it and I hear it. I'm like, oh yeah, that's just send a Bassett.
And so it follows that people in nature.
What's his bitch's name? Hey, you dumb cunt. Yeah, no one knows. Oh yeah, just send a Bassett. That's that bitch from that one show. Really? Oh yeah, we send the Bassett. That bitch is like, she's from like all those people. They used to do shit. Hey dog, wanna look inside my phone? Psych, bitch. I want that to be fucking infinite loop. That'd be sick as fuck. Yo, you have that one chick on there? Zero. No one likes this. I didn't like it.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
I know the last sound, bitch.
Need to catch up? This is Wall Street Week. I'm David West. We've got the information and insight.
A lot of these areas still have very, very good valuations.
From business's most influential and instrumental.
We're looking at a gold bond. It's not a great time to speculate. It's time for a pivot truck and buy this.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week. Live tonight with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Hey, Kim.
Getting some fascinating comments from the Bundesbank
Hey, dude,
president
you
this
suck.
morning. The chief of the German central bank
Is that
will keep raising
Germany?
rates for as long as needed because of inflation.
I'm ahead of that. I'd be like, what the fuck is this getting called? They'd be like, the Bundesbank. I'd be like, all right. You guys like that Coke?
Well, especially given the backdrop.
No, we actually wear Pepsi.
Oh,
God, wouldn't it be cool if they
suddenly perhaps the rate hiking cycle is over? The fact that you get hawkish comments like that really telling. On the flip side, are people buying it? Take a look at that German 2-year yield. It's tanking like a stone. You can see it down to 2.27% from as high as 3.3% on March 8th, that pivotal moment. So maybe he's just, making a lot of noise, and people are just kind of like,
Oh, dog. What do you mean? Of course it's not. Soda, dog. Remember when you were like, hey, up,
second week of gains. Might wipe that out at the opening band if this continues. We're down about 0.8% on the S&P. On the Nasdaq, down 0.5%.
No, dog.
You're familiar with the weightings on the Russell?
Can I get everybody to pin this to the
towards
profile?
the financials.
For world
The
peace?
Nasdaq does not have that tilt. The Russell is negative by more than 1%. In the bond market,
I like how this motherfucker's like, put it in my face.
Lisa down 22
What is
basis
3.5,
points.
dog?
Making the move yesterday.
Your sick, your shit is so sick. I'd be like, oh, dog, my dude's got it all. My kid has all that shit.
we saw that peak of more than 5% for the 2-year, coming all the way down to 3.6%.
Dog, your tweet
Something
was
broke.
sick.
And that is the only way to understand this chart. Why are Fed officials, why are central bankers in Europe not reflecting that? And if we're wrong, what's going to give confidence to the market that no, nothing is broken? You guys are just histrionic.
On the high from Wednesday.
Was that bitch like a fucking like administrative assistant, and then she became like super
Again, this
girl
is
at
the
fucking
most
cricket?
liquid, most
Maggie.
used benchmark in the
Look
world
how sick you
in
are.
terms of the bond market. When you look at U.S. Treasuries, these yields jumping
5
around
people
to this
view that
degree.
shit,
What does that
and
tell
no
you
one
about where
likes
we are and how wide the parameters of outcomes are?
it. No one
dollar
do
down
that.
0.9%. The euro against the US dollar
Motherfuckers had 30 views.
31. That's a weak euro. Stronger dollar in the mix. That hasn't been the story in the last week. So the dollar Lisa kicking back in as well.
Alright, remember
They
you
even
ate your
trade
face?
as people get worried about the banks. How much are
Yeah,
people
remember
pitting
you ate your
European
face?
banks versus U.S. banks and then making a currency call on it seriously? Because that's essentially
Face, yeah,
what seems to be
that's good.
happening. You can't explain it by divergence in monetary policy because that would be supportive of the euro.
We'll keep you up to speed on
Yeah,
what's
you
happening
know,
with
it was
Deutsche
like
Bank as
real
well.
versus
Stocks down about
video.
13%. Gotta say, no
That was
news.
sick as
No
fuck.
real news in the last
Really?
24 hours for this.
Dude, I got 69 fucking upvotes. That's all I needed.
They might get caught
I
up in
mean,
DOJ.
not
Who knows?
upvotes.
How that turns out.
That's
We know that
so
those
sick.
fines can be.
That shit is so
They can be
fucking
hefty. They can
baller.
also create some reputational risk at a time when they were really solidifying their reputation in a much more concrete way. You're right. There is no news. Deutsche Bank, in fact, buying back some of their subordinated bonds
Yo,
to try
dog, look at my
to,
normal
fortify
Asian
their
face.
balance sheet. This should be positive, I would
Maybe
think.
that shit
I don't
sucks.
understand
I
unless
like
they're just
this
a people
version, whatever this
looking
thing
at
is.
potential counterparty risk, or I
Bitch
don't want to
makes
spread
us go
rumors,
like
but
10 years old.
what would cause this? And maybe people just pile on.
Was there anything positive about this? Take a listen to the TikTok CEO in front of Congress on Capitol Hill, in front of a House committee. Take a listen.
I have seen no
Dude,
evidence.
Zangsta, you gangsta, girl. Remember Zangsta? Yeah, guys, remember Zangsta? Yeah, Zangsta, that bitch was gangsta.
I have seen no evidence of this happening. And in order to assure everybody here and all our users, our commitment is to move the data into the United States to be stored on American soil by an American company, overseen by American personnel.
Clearly nothing he said yesterday was going to be sufficient. So here it is. Let's make it really, really simple. He can't change their minds. They don't like the plan he has to protect and store data here. in the United States. They clearly don't trust this company. So I would say this, the longer they do this with the TikTok CEO, the more foolish the representatives of Congress start to look, because they need to do something about it then, and they've got to make a decision. Now, forcing a sale is the easy way out. Unfortunately, China will not allow that sale to go through. And that just agitates those who think China has the ultimate say over this company, so it becomes even more simpler than that. Ban it or don't ban it. But the longer you have these hearings without banning it, I think the more foolish the government looks, and not the TikTok CEO.
I would take that a step further and say it actually emboldens the CEO, because this is a PR move for him too. If you just clip out his responses, he looks measured and cool and trying to answer in a firing squad. And for all the people who are trying to say, look, he's just another executive, then he'll actually gain credibility. And on the flip side, to your point, if this is an issue for national security,
do something about it.
Very clear.
Do something about it. And clearly forced sales are not going to be allowed by China, so you're left with one option, not to ban, or to ban. It's not complex, is it? It really isn't.
It gets more complicated when it's the young voters that
precisely
get really upset and tactics. Come on. Since when did you believe that big
if it's about national security, there shouldn't be a question. We talked about this yesterday. Terry Haynes of Pangaea is going to join us a little bit later. Look out for that conversation. We'll catch up with him in about 10 minutes' time. We've got a euro. There's a whole lot weaker today. Euro dollar, negative 0.9%. Alison Linios joins us now, global head of FX strategy at RBC. Alison, can we just start the price section of this morning? What do you make it was developing at the moment?
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because we have gone up and down this week, and basically back to where we were, I think, at some point on Wednesday. And it's, as you said earlier, two very different drivers pulling in opposite directions. On the one hand, you've got the rate differential, and as Lisa said, that in isolation would argue for euro dollar higher. On the other hand, when we pivot away from worrying about US banks to worrying about European banks, as markets are this morning, then that pushes euro dollar lower. What's really interesting to me, though, is that ultimately we're not going anywhere, and that realized vol in FX is a whole lot lower than it is in other asset classes at the moment, and that in itself gives rise to some interesting trades.
Also, last year everyone was a macro investor, a macro analyst. This year, everyone is a bank analyst, or at least for the past 2 weeks. Given that, how much do you have to examine the balance sheets of banks on both sides of the Atlantic to make a currency call?
Yeah, one of my FX clients made that comment yesterday. You know, in the FX market, we're all suddenly experts on something. You know, previously it was weather balloons, and before that it was Ukrainian munitions, and now it's bank stocks. But the reality is that is what's driving our market at the moment. And you know, luckily we do have a very good team of bank analysts in house at RBC, and they will make some points around the fact that you have a very well-regulated, well-capitalized banking sector in Europe, and that gives a lot of people a fair degree of confidence. That said, when it starts getting like it is today, you know, you see some quite large price action on the back of very little new news. It does worry people, and the euro is naturally a loser in that environment.
So how do you explain this in terms of the technicals of the market, the underpinning of the market? If there's a move that feeds on itself, that is pretty violent, that gives rise to narratives that potentially are deeply uncomfortable, but there is no logic behind it that's discernible.
So I think what's making it even trickier at the moment, and in part perhaps explains the disconnect we're seeing between rates, FX, and equities, is that you've had investors very heavily positioned in some areas, very lightly positioned in others. I think part of the reason why FX is actually not really moving that much is precisely because it's not been the key area of focus for macro investors. We had a lot of people heavily positioned in rates at the start of the year, positions getting extended further through February when everybody was sure that it was going to be a much higher, tighter, longer rate increase cycle. And now that's where you're seeing the pain as all that gets washed out. So from a currency perspective, we've actually been fairly safe and able to eke out gains on the relative value trades or crosses, rather than just trying to take a bet on dollar up or dollar down.
How much is the dollar going to continue acting as a haven, given the fact that what you're saying sounds like short squeezes, unwinds of trades, things that are highly specific to a market structure rather than some sort of macro event?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because it's what you would have expected to some degree this week. I mean, if we listened to Chair Powell on Wednesday, what effectively he was saying is, we can't really give you forward guidance at the moment because we can write things down in the dot plot, but the reality is it's going to be determined by facts on the ground. And those cuts that are priced by the market could be justified, but the conditions that would warrant those cuts would be pretty aggressively bad conditions. So in that kind of environment, well, what do? You buy havens, you buy the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc, the two most obvious ones, but you also buy the US dollar against risk proxies. And that's not what the market did this week. You know, we actually saw the dollar underperforming some of the riskier currencies. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think today we're seeing a little bit more sense return to markets where you're actually seeing the dollar start to outperform some of those riskier currencies. And in order to see that extend going forward, I think you begin to need to see it in the actual data. We'll get, you know, it'll be some time before we get the quarterly senior loan officer survey from the US, but we have some weekly indicators. I think that's what markets will be focused on going forward to take that cue.
Thank you. That's letting us then of RBC. What else is said at the end there, I think it's really important. When they say data dependent, you've got to ask dependent on what data? The senior loan survey. That's it. It's going to come down to that. Well, no, that's what everyone seems to be focused on, not CPI, not payrolls. It's lending standards in America. That's the data point going forward. I've joked it's banking stocks, but you know where I'm going when I say
my lower
people want to
back
understand
is
how much
killing
banks
me.
are restraining credit in response to some of the concerns around their balance sheet. People were also plumbing some of the Federal Reserve data that came out yesterday evening around 4:15 and 4:30 p.m. yesterday to understand the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve surging to the highest levels going back to 2021. I mean, we're just seeing a resurgence, and people want to understand why and what this means for the stress that we're seeing in the banking system.
Look at this move on a 2 year. Only a couple of weeks ago, north of 5%. Right now, 3.58. This move right now, 350 of 110 basis points. Back on March 8th, and right now it's negative 30. At least a moment ago, it was negative 28. And if you take your pick on a curve right now, that's 2's 10s. Let's go 2's 30s.
Maybe I can
2 year
put
against
that
the 30 year. It's now positive. It's now positive. I'll try and save the bond market jargon for you, but that is one heck of a bull steepener that's come into this bond market over the last couple of weeks, which basically means the front end leads the move. Yields aggressively lower at the front end as we start pricing in what? Cuts. The Fed said this week, median dot
You can light a
23,
candle, you
just like
can
the
just
projections back in
smoke,
December,
dog.
5.1%.
Yo, look at this. Yo, dog.
This market,
Smoke,
one,
dog.
doubts whether they can get there, and two, even if they can, they're not going to be there very long
My
based on
lower
this market
back.
pricing.
What's interesting is also you are seeing, yes, it's a bull steepener. You are seeing this really led by the front end, but longer yields are also going lower. And so this isn't necessarily a belief that cutting rates is going to cause runaway inflation. This is a complete reset of the whole inflationary backdrop that everyone's been talking about. It's a different time. It's an inflationary regime. Now people are like, yeah, not that inflationary.
Big movie, baby.
Yeah,
And all of a sudden, this financial stress is a disinflationary shock.
for a long time.
What Michael JP Morgan said, every single point across the curve, 2 year out to 30 year, 3.00%. That was the call.
I'm old enough to remember when
We're getting closer. The 10 years at 3.29.
I'm old enough to remember when people were calling for 7% 10-year yields.
That was good, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Was that last week?
Exactly.
Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy on TikTok next.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Lisa Mateo. UBS and Credit Suisse are among the banks being looked at in a U.S. Justice Department investigation. Authorities want to know whether finance professionals helped Russian oligarchs at some major U.S. banks. Credit Suisse and UBS both declined to comment. The U.S. has carried out airstrikes in Syria following a deadly attack there that killed one American contractor and wounded 5 service members. U.S. officials say a drone of Iranian origin crashed into a coalition base.
That's so
According to the
sick.
Pentagon, the U.S. airstrikes hit facilities linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards.
I want
In
you
North
to open
Korea,
the door,
Kim
but I want you to
Jong-un
open the door
oversaw
for him.
tests of weapons designed to deliver
confusing.
nuclear attacks
Greg
against
just
the
has to
U.S.
open this
and
fucking
its
door.
allies.
He
One of them
slams
was
it every
described as an underwater
He's
drone
gonna
that
slam
could
it door.
create a, quote, radioactive tsunami. The official North Korean news agency says the drone cruised for nearly 60 hours before detonating. The test also included cruise missiles carrying modern nuclear warheads. Billionaire bond investor Jerry Gundlach is joining the Jerome Powell is wrong chorus. The chief investment officer of Double I Capital sees the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates substantially soon. And markets are signaling the Fed is wrong when it talks about the prospect for further interest rate hikes. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
Steve's ability on the course may not be etched in any record books, but following him around, it's clear that it's not for lack of trying.
Look at this shit.
Constantly hustling behind him as he caught up with executives in the portfolio companies and reminisced with former and current players.
He's a day trader, self-made day trader, and so he's on the bus after a game, and he's day trading on the bus.
Get on the bus. That's movie.
In many ways, it's a convention, right? Of people that I don't see maybe once a year, and so it's kind of all
Oh, this motherfucker's in the chill zone.
charity, fundraising efforts, and the friends there. My dad and my brother, it all happens right there as a confluence of all these
What's
parts
up,
of my life that have found its common center.
This motherfucker in the chill zone. Slut. My lower back is killing me.
Lisa, you've got to explain this one to me. What does it mean when the White House says we're watching markets carefully?
Wild West. Jim West. Desperado.
I've been in and seen it. Lots of
What is this?
I've seen the Bloomberg. I've seen the Bloomberg.
You're shadowing us. No one knows.
What does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean?
It means they have a Bloomberg.
Or somebody who
New York City, London, Washington,
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai.
Good morning, everyone. Here's what I'm watching. You do not want to miss this story.
Welcome aboard, Sharon.
New stuff.
Thanks.
I think that's good.
Impossible. I mean, could it be turned off to another medication or another would have had on creative thought?
That guy gave me a lot of money. I bet that shit's worth.
Government has access to that data. They have never asked us. We have not provided.
But you know what?
I've asked that.
I find that actually preposterous.
I have looked in. I have seen no evidence of this happening. And in order to assure everybody here and all our users, our commitment is to move the data into the United States to be stored on American soil by an American company, overseen by American personnel.
That was the TikTok CEO. A very polished, slick performance. Pretty slick dude, Lisa, I've got to say. Across a number of hours, but ultimately not making a difference whatsoever. It was never going to make a difference. Nobody's mind was ever going to be changed. Terry Haynes of Pangea said this. This hearing, quote, is the debate is due process, completing the hearing record before beginning to legislate. Terry went on to say that creating a prime opportunity for the TikTok CEO to compound negatively the issues that beset the app's continued use in the US. Terry, I'm pleased to say, joins us now. Terry, what did you make of that?
Well, you've never seen a better example of somebody publicly lighting themselves on fire in a congressional hearing yesterday. The famous quote will always be the quotes when asked if they used gather data to spy on U.S. citizens. The response began, I don't think spying is the right way to describe it. My comment on that, as you know, was, and I quote, kaboom, in full. So what you have here is a situation where there's a lot of diversionary stuff being thrown around here. The basics are these. You have the heads of the
Chinese cuts. This is what we call it. Chinese. We used to call these Chinese cuts. Why? You just let all your friends in, dog.
Security concern because, as the FBI director said, can be used to control software.
Chinese fire bills, Chinese cut.
Also drive narratives that divide Americans. The bipartisan heads of the intelligence committees, Senate and House, agree with that. Is in the lead committee in the House that does the Energy and Commerce Committee. And so what you're going to end
end up with here is, I think, is not an outright ban of TikTok, but you're going to have the administration given the tools to ban, to control, whatever is necessary TikTok in a broader swath of apps or other sorts of issues.
That seems like the direction of travel, at least over the next several months. Terry, I just wonder the option this president, this administration will ultimately choose. It feels like.
And they also mentioned that governments and corporations are going to be watching everything that we send.
That was like my Mickey Dank Mouse.
Hey, George, welcome to the program. Hey, Scott, George, you're
Mickey Dank Mouse, bitch.
Sounds like Satan. He's dancing both sides of the coin. One, he said he's a Christian, and then the other side, he's giving the pros and cons of putting your cell phone or whatever you call it in your head. I studied Neuralink, man. Elon Musk and everything he's doing, man, going to hell.
Like that a forced sale is a non-starter. The Chinese government's already said they won't.
Well, Scott's opposed to it. Scott, I haven't heard you say anything positive about it, really. Well, there have been a couple of questions you've asked.
How about this one? Yoshi. Like, oh, no. Mac was over here listening to Craig. Craig was over here like, bah, bah, bah.
Clearly, there are some things.
I like those Rafiki ones.
Going to attract people to this technology.
Lions are club.
By and large, I say, what good is it? What good is all those benefits if 4 years down the road?
Lisa and I were talking about how just that response alone agitates those who believe that the Chinese government has the final say of this company. It's just the nature of doing business in China. Tell me, how do you think this story ends? Do they ban it, or won't they ban it?
Probably ends with like masturbating before death.
I absolutely agree with you about the forced sale, by the way. And let me say, not only
Yo, dog. Yo, should be like, oh, then this redheaded bitch was working at Amazon. She was like 12 years old. And she could get it. I bet she's 18. I know she's 18. Well, yeah, I bet she's 18, man. She looks like she's 12. But she's like 19. I mean, I'll tell you this right now. I'd rather fuck your mom. Got it?
And the algorithm is supposedly either some kind of state secret or at least, very shrouded in commercial proprietary nature. So, what you have here is a situation
yeah, it didn't matter, kid, that you say you'd rather fuck their moms. You said on video to the 24-year-old girl who looked like she was 19.
TikTok becomes the first example of this. And yeah, I do think it's eventually banned.
I was like, dog. You're so sick.
75% likely by end of 2023.
Yo, that dog wasn't in the chill zone. I was like, dude.
Terry, let's talk about timing.
How about the chill zone? How about you take a break in the chill zone?
Or do we have to wait until election
I was like,
cycle
yo,
is over before
this motherfucker was like, let's take a break in the chill zone. Oh, verification. Maybe later. Well, it's not the kind of time, dog. Click to verify.
Before, because what she had to do,
well, I should buy
the legislation passed,
oh, dog. Star Singers in this. Oh, you're so sick. I watched American Psycho with Ronaldo Casino last night, and he seemed like a really chill dog. Why don't we invite him up and let him masturbate openly in front of 500 Reddit, Wall Street bets, traders? And like, dog, I'm kind of busy. I'm uploading this thing. We got Craig with the Apple. He's talking. Can't hear what he's saying.
Or broader international policy. I want to read you this quote from the
That's
Biden
a
White
lot
House
of work,
advisor,
dog.
former Biden White House advisor. The TikTok battles are indicative of the end of an era. This era where U.S.-Chinese business relations can continue absent considerations.
This bitch looks like Saki. Really?
Terry,
Yeah.
how much does a potential ban of TikTok implicate other companies that are of Chinese
Lady.
origin that do business in the U.S.?
Once they hear me quick, that's my question for you.
Sure. I mean, but what you're seeing now is, I don't think I agree with the end of an era comment, but that's what we're now moving into is a situation where the geopolitics are different, frankly.
What if you did this? You guys should be like, oh, dog, if you went like this, and then you went like this,
top to bottom.
Don't tell you about it. Then you went like this.
In a way that's
Dude, so
broader
sick.
than the
So
way
sick.
that it
There's a
used
bit.
to
Oh
be
my
done
god, my day.
solely over the Symbians.
Unable to log conversation. Really? That logged him out. Then he was all pissed. This sucks.
So those will all be.
Oh, dog, look at that one.
But you're going to be looking at this much more broadly.
I like it. I like it a lot. That's my favorite one. Where it's like, no, yeah, we're going the wrong way. Oh, those are the best ones. Right? It's just art, baby. That shit's just art.
To the basic argument.
Sometimes it doesn't work out the way you want.
Whatever happened to that argument?
Yo, dog.
My
friend.
Just the idea that if they want to be here, the United States should be able to be there.
Well, I think that's still valid. I think that still remains. But what you have is now
And then,
a decade
my friend,
more
I
where
took a shit.
American policymakers have
with
gradually
your
gotten more aware of the other basics, and the other basics include the fact that intellectual property
Yo,
of
dog.
American companies is stolen in
Then
China.
it was like,
that
hey, dog,
technology is stolen.
while we're checking your browser, please stand by while we're checking your
on
browser.
American companies to gain
Please stand
advantage.
by while checking
And
your
there is an
browser.
overwhelming sense that
Suck on
particular,
my dick now.
Great to catch up, Terry.
Yo.
As always, Terry Haynes there of Pangea on the latest. Just
Remember when I
brilliant.
hit
Right now,
refresh?
Get in touch with Terry and get hold of it. He's leaning hard. Lisa towards a ban.
85% chance he thinks after that hearing, he really does hone in on that one moment where they asked, whether TikTok spies on people who use the platform. And the executive said, I wouldn't call it exactly spying. And that was just, to Terry's
I
world.
wouldn't describe it that way.
Kaboom.
This was never going to change anyone's minds. And to his point, it's just kind of like the process till they get to legislate. And then ultimately, it's over to the president and the administration.
Oh,
to
dog.
make a decision.
Queefing like a dog.
Again, though, I do wonder,
Really?
He said at this
I
point,
queef like a
there's so
dog.
much bipartisan support. You can't imagine that
Yo.
politics gets in the way too much. I can imagine it. I mean, I do think that always has been in the back of people's minds because we've been talking about this for a long time. I also wonder how much
Yo,
it
she
complicates
was like,
the issue
oh,
that
dog,
there are concerns about social
you're so
media on a
sick.
broader level. And so there's some discussion around that muddies the conversation about national security.
And clearly, there's a big divide. I would say a major divide between how
Who's in charge
Congress
here?
feels about the national security
Nick,
issue with
what
China,
is it to you?
the reality of the situation, and how the consumers who use that app feel about it.
I love going
Because I
into
don't think
voice chat, being
they
like,
care
oh
about
yeah, there's like
at
a
all.
fucking
It's just
hierarchy.
Did you see those comments?
Oh, can I see the org chart of this voice chat?
I know people are going to think that I'm just trying to take your fun away.
Fucking
but,
loser.
You'll care about this someday. And you heard a lot of, trying to convince people.
Yo, dog, send this motherfucker asked for an org chart of our fucking voice chat. I was like, fuck you,
But it's
dog.
incredibly popular with the American consumer. Incredibly
Really?
popular.
And I would argue that, and I know that this is the case at home because we have these
Are you done?
discussions.
Suck
A lot
my
of
dick.
people who use the platform
Are
think
you
that they are immune to any kind of misinformation. They're immune to manipulation. They're immune to being, sort of influenced one way or
Yo,
another
dog,
through the
leave it.
platform. They say, we
Leave
get
it to
silly
Beaver,
news
dog.
bits, we get, fun dance
Leave it
moves.
to
We don't
Beaver.
necessarily.
The
I'm
beef.
talking, specifically
Leave
at
it to
home.
the beef.
Other people who are progeny, but I'm curious what kind of influences they could be subject to, whether we should have class on, propaganda and the importance of being, just the importance of being
communism.
Well, I'm not even saying that. I mean, just the critical thinking skills. I'm talking in a broad sense, critical thinking skills. I think that's really important to
education system.
I think that's
Got to understand about the dangers of communism.
It's not just communism. It's also
It's the whole social
Show dog.
process.
No, it's
You guys should be like, oh, dog, this kid was so sick.
not what I'm saying.
Invest, enjoy my show.
Hey.
Grandma's not going to stay.
No, I'm not.
Who's annoying as fuck? Greg Rejaszowski. Mickey Daniels having a great day. At my mom's house. Good luck to my mom's. I just don't trust them. They're fucking rude.
Most actors are thrilled that they have one part like Rocky and the whole career. You had another one, Rambo. Now, Rambo was not something you created, is that right?
No, Rambo was created
Damn, he has so many followers.
I don't know who
How about Peanut? Amy, what the fuck you doing, girl? Are you done?
So this would be sort of a pariah. Just trying to see if we can get to the part of it. I want him to go right to the edge of my push back because
That bitch is at 3 views, 8 views, 4 views, no views, 32 views, 32 views, no views, 18 views. Oh, dog. Look at this move, yo. No one's ever gonna believe it. Sickest shit ever. My video paused. Here's your next thing. Are you done? Yeah. Don't you remember when it was like, oh, God. I wonder if anybody's in that wonder. Where like, oh, dog, you're like, hey, can we please do a thing? And they're like, no. You're like, please. You're like, no. You're like, oh, yeah, let's not forget about that, because I'm going to fucking shit on your throat, dog. Be fucking dog. Yo, so that was so sick. Yo, there. Dude, yo, sharing emoji. Here's that kid, dude. That is so Haven.
This is
Press change icons. Belly on layaway. Get a belly on layaway. Who's this? Cool guy.
That has to do something. His credibility is still on the line.
We don't think that there is a material risk of broad-based challenges. Instead, we've been calling for this bumpy landing.
What matters and what actually shocks my economic and inflation models is how fast they cut and when they start cutting.
The market is anticipating a lot of rate cuts this year. Our economy still thinks it's off in the future.
The Fed is going to be on hold until inflation gets down to something much closer to 2%, and that's, I think, going to take a while.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
What a move to start Friday with. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning for our audience worldwide. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on TV and radio, alongside Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Farrow. TK's back on Monday. He's missing out on this. Equity futures down 0.75% on the S&P 500. In the bond market, yields lower at the front end of the curve again on a 2-year. Lisa by more than 20 basis points. It was today, yesterday, day before that. It's been relentless over the last 3 days.
It's been, since March 8th, it's been over a percentage point. We've seen yields go from 5.1% to 3.6% in just a matter of a couple of weeks.
Too much fun. Why aren't you running
rate hiking cycle. And as they look at something that appears to have broken.
We've got to talk about a couple of names, haven't we? Deutsche Bank down 13% over in German trading. Looking at Swiss trading EBS right now.
This girl, I was like, oh, this goes great.
They're having a soft session to close out this week.
I don't know what El Salino says because of RBC. We're talking about how there's a lack of news here. So what exactly is fueling some of the declines that we've seen, particularly in Deutsche Bank shares and credit default swaps? She said it seems like they're big trades that are unwinding, that people are making big moves that are reflected in different asset classes all at the same time. Treasuries,
I was just checking you out, making
I
sure
just
you're
don't have a
cool.
handle on what kind
you
of
seen?
outcomes
And
there could be in terms of losses, personal
unbelievable.
pain, and how
Cool.
I don't want to use
I was like, I know.
Idiosyncratic.
Right? Oh, for sure, dog. Yo, tell him the story. And I should bet, oh, Smacker had this story. And he was like this, and he was like this. And his legs were cold. Really? Oh, he had cold legs.
So that's a much weaker
That's
euro, stronger dollar
the
index. We've
price,
gone from 108.39 at the high of the session, the low 107.19, which is basically where we are right now. That euro weakness developing through the session this morning, even with the Bundesbank president, the chief of the German central bank, coming out and saying we're going to keep on hiking. We haven't won the fight against inflation. Oh, and by the way, QT, I'd like to speed that up in Q3.
Yeah, that's sexy.
Do you think anyone in this market is buying what he's selling? I mean, honestly, if you take a look at German 2-year yields, do you actually think that people are saying, oh my goodness, you're really going to be hawkish? They're basically saying, yeah, right. When the facts change, yield change, and we're ahead of it. And that's certainly what you're seeing in the market. I do just want to know one thing before I give you a sense of what we're watching in the day ahead. The data in terms of where's all that money going, when people ask, going out of banks, it's going into money market funds. And you saw money market fund outstandings surge the most over the past 2 weeks since April of 2020 to a new record, more than $200 billion flowing in some of these funds, which I think is really compelling.
Michael Hahn of Bank of America wrote about this morning. He said up 300 billion, more than 300 billion in the past 4 weeks. He identified the previous two surges, 08-20, and correctly saying that they coincided with big Fed cuts. Now the inflation backdrop now is very different. We all understand that. Will this coincide with big cuts? This market is screaming. Absolutely yes. Let's go. Let's look at this market right now. Futures negative 0.8% on the S&P 500. The market yields lower 14 basis points. Your 10-year sub 330, 328.54 on a 2-year down 25 basis points. Lisa, it's a break of 360 at 358.
It's just wild to see some of the moves over the past couple of weeks, and this is the reason why people say
Remember
economic
this
data
bitch
no
when she
longer
was like,
matters. You can see economic data surprises coming out, kind of bouncing around positive and negative, basically evening each other out. 8:30 a.m. we get the latest irrelevant U.S. economic data until it is relevant. U.S. durable goods orders. I'm curious whether we see this disinflation continue. What happens if you get a reinflation? What happens if suddenly something comes out that challenges a narrative that credit's getting dried up and that we're going back to a very low inflation kind of environment? At 9:30 a.m., weighing in on this, St. Louis Fed President James Bullard. He's speaking at an event in St. Louis. Over to you. Are you going to basically be like what we heard from the Bundesbank, or are you going to come out and say, you know what, we're listening to what the market is watching. If we see ongoing stresses in the banking system, that 2-year yield accurately pricing in a rate cutting cycle that could occur. He's not going to say that, but that's what we want to be listening for. Today also, bids are finally due for Silicon Valley Bank. The FDIC did push back the deadline. There is discussion about who could potentially step in here. It's not a big bank. Right now, the rumor is customers of Bancorp, that's according to Bloomberg reporting, exploring a deal for all or part of the bank. John, how much is it important that it's another regional bank? Come together moment, plan together, get strong, get bigger, but not too big. And this is really the question.
Yeah, just right.
Yeah.
Sucking
a fairy tale,
baby.
Not too hard, not too cold, just right. It's a mess, isn't it?
Who's the bear and who's the goldilocks?
Here's another mess. I won't get into that. First Republic right now, down 3%, which is a minor move considering the moves we have seen during this week. Surprised Lisa May going to go into the weekend without some kind of resolution solution for this bank, given all the reports we heard earlier this week that we've gone from depositing money at that institution to then discussing doing something extra. And there's something extra. It's gone very quiet around the last couple of days.
Again, we talked about this with UBS and Credit Suisse, where UBS was concerned about the liabilities. Well, what liabilities are you bringing on when you take on one of these banks that does have a concentrated lending portfolio, that does have a greater risk of deposit flight? And that, I think, is one of the hang-ups that's causing delays as people try to assess their due diligence.
With us now, Troy Gayeski, Chief Market Strategist at FS Investments. Troy, great morning for it. Thanks for being with us and good morning, sir.
It worked out far faster than we had hoped. Look, I think we're still in a situation where we know inflation's coming down, but we don't think it's going to come down quite as fast as markets are pricing in.
Right
As you know, right now the Fed is trying to have a very delicate hands, right? On the one hand, they're continuing to do quantitative tightening, and they've just tightened 25 basis points. On the other hand, they're injecting massive amounts of liquidity through emergency lending facilities. They've done about 65% of QT in as little as 2 weeks. So, clearly from the banking system side, you're going to get less lending, which creates opportunities for liquidity providers, which is going to constrain inflation. But on the flip side of that is, money supply growth has started to explode again, and you do have a tremendous amount of cash, and that cash can be used for consumption, particularly in services, where we still have an extremely tight labor market. So, up until the banking crisis, it was pretty straightforward. The Fed's trading liquidity, asset prices are going down, inflation's going to simmer for longer. Now you have these opposing forces that are very difficult to price in real time. However, as long as the banking system stresses remain, it's unlikely that you get a significant surge in the 2-year yield, at least over the next several weeks.
What you just said is pretty radical. And parsing between the lines, a lot of people point to what the Fed is doing in terms of balance sheet expansion. There's a big debate. Is it quantitative easing, essentially, or is it not? Because it's a unique kind of instrument that is basically an emergency lending tool. What you were just saying there is inflation is not going to come down as much. And, oh, yeah, by the way, that basically is feeding a lot more capital into the system, and that will boost risk assets. So how long can that go on? Is this basically quantitative easing that will continue to boost risk assets even if it doesn't bring down inflation?
Yeah, so the boosting risk assets is a tricky one, right? Because in the immediate short term, Lisa, think about what this means for forward revenue growth for companies. Think about what it means for forward earnings. So from a multiple compression standpoint, given how much money supply has expanded in 2 weeks, we probably hit the multiple low of 15.5 to 16 in October. However, from a revenue earnings growth standpoint, it's looking almost laughable that we're going to have 12% earnings growth in 24, and it's more than likely that earnings roll over pretty significantly in Q3, Q4. So we've probably put a floor in the short term for multiple compression. So the next leg down for equities will be driven more by earnings growth rolling over to earnings contraction, and then recession risk, which has been pulled forward pretty significantly and now looks meaningfully darker than it did as recently as 3 weeks ago.
How do you determine catching a falling knife versus finding opportunities, Troy, at a time when people are looking at commercial real estate and saying, wow, a lot more pain there, potentially certain banks, wow, they could also be next. How do you parse out what's too risky and what's just risky enough?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lisa. So I think the catching a falling knife is something you want to avoid. Unless you have to own assets that are going down by mandate, avoid that. Look for areas on the margins that have already had attractive opportunities, whether it's interest-only cash flows in residential mortgage-backed securities, whether it's senior secured lending, that will be helped at least marginally by tighter credit conditions in the banking system. So you're not sitting there saying, hey, I'm going to go along the KRE and hope for the best, or start buying up regional banks in droves. Instead, you're looking at strategies that were already in a very good position and can benefit more as credit conditions tighten. The flip side of that is when you look at ways to get at least marginally more offensive, one of the things we continue to look at is dividend futures, which took it on the chin in this sell-off. But if you look at regional banks in general, they make up a very small percentage of the dividends in the S&P. And so even if you take those out, as long as we avoid a hard landing, it's unlikely that dividends decline. But clearly, if we have a hard landing, you can take a little bit of mark-to-market pain on that.
Troy, if you've taken your annual leave, took 2 weeks off, and came back,
Look,
you've noticed this conversation has shifted really, really quickly. From no landing to the possibility of a hard landing and pricing in a massive rate cutting cycle from the Federal Reserve. Is there anywhere in your mind that we can see developments in the next 2 weeks that might reverse this conversation again?
It's really hard because, even the upcoming inflation and growth data is somewhat lagged. It's very difficult to capture the degree of potential lack of credit creation and potential credit decline. So the banking system had already started to flatline in terms of loan growth
Look at this
prior
move.
to the
Oh my
conventional
God,
community
George.
bank issues that we're seeing now. So we're pretty
Cover
certain that
since
lending growth is going to roll over and become negative, but that will not show up in the
God,
data
everybody left.
in real time. It will start to show up in the commercial bank lending growth. So that's probably the best signal to say, again, we're not saying the Fed's cutting as aggressively as markets pricing in, because we doubt they will. The reality is somewhere in between where we were 2 weeks ago and where we are today. But it's very hard to see the next week or so where you get a positive catalyst from inflation or economic growth that causes the recent drop in yields to reverse as rapidly as they've fallen. So very different environment in 2 weeks. Just a reminder that when the Fed tightens, real things break, and unfortunately, real things are breaking now.
Things are breaking, Troy. Thank you. Trogaski of FS Investments. Someone once told me there's catching a falling knife, and there's putting your hand in a food blender. I'm just wondering if that's what we're at right now for some of these nights. I'm just sitting on my hands right now. Just soon, you know, it's a good image. That was good weeks at the time. And they were referring at the time to the Swiss franc. Patrick Armstrong,
Look at this, bro.
Plurimi Wealth joining us shortly.
God damn, kid.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Lisa Mateo.
Hey.
U.S. prosecutors
Hey,
have charged
Lisa
Terraform
Mateo.
Labs co-founder
Wanna get
No
fingered?
Fun with orchestrating a massive cryptocurrency fraud.
Yo.
It's said to have wiped out at least
Look at this,
$40
bro.
million in market value.
Yo,
One was
she-
already a fugitive from charges
I'll
in his
give you
native
a
South
few
Korea.
minutes.
He was arrested Thursday in
Matter.
Montenegro. In Japan, inflation slowed for the first time in more than a year. Consumer prices, excluding fresh food, it rose 3.1% in February from a year ago, down more than a full percentage point. But without the impact of government subsidies for energy and travel, inflation would have been as high as 4.4%. China is urging to play a role in supporting peace talks for Russia's war in Ukraine. That's despite the U.S. warning the Beijing proposals would effectively freeze the Kremlin's territorial gates. China's top diplomat spoke to a French official about the peace plan, and not long after, Xi Jinping wrapped up meetings with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
And no, that's what John Kennedy. ViralRabbi. Is it called ViralRabbi? Oh man, this one's great, George. Oh, you gotta fight. Get the fuck out of here. Oh god.
Think of a bathtub of water, that's your soul. When you incarnate, you're only going to take a piece of your soul. So you take a glass of water, which would represent your body. You take a glass of water out. That water in that glass is your spirit. So a piece of your soul, your spirit.
George, this is so sick. Really?
And then when it's time to leave the earth plane, you dump the water back in the pot. In the next incarnation, we take out another glass of water. It's not identical, but the inside of the information is available in that cup of water so that from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, there's different aspects of our soul.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg's famous
That's pretty close.
markets trying to open. This is Bloomberg Technology. Welcome to Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
That's pretty good, bro.
Access to financial world on demand.
You know, to me, it's just so feeling it's like the breath of life.
Hear from leading economists, industry experts, via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com webinars.
Very good.
We indeed have a rally talking a lot of dividends. We're talking income.
What's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ. Monday on Bloomberg. Springs. No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
I've never seen anything like it. This was a decision that maybe was the best out of 3 very bad decisions, but it did prove to be true.
She opposed Powell's renomination. She called him a dangerous man in 2021, and now she is really pointing the blame at the Fed.
Expecting that you can hear in Brussels today. This is a meeting that happens regularly, but obviously today it will be all about the banks.
Bloomberg, your global business authority.
Yeah, sure. There's no
As I've said, we've used important
lady
tools to act quickly
STFU,
to
baby.
prevent contagion, and they are tools we could use again. The strong actions we've taken ensure that Americans'
Man, I'm
deposits
not
are
Jerome
safe.
Powell. Is Jerome Powell
Certainly,
playing
we will be
Powell?
prepared to take
Maybe, kid.
additional
Maybe.
actions if warranted.
Really?
That last line is a new line from Secretary Yellen, but that new line is not really making a difference. 5 different ways to say the same thing by Secretary Yellen over the last week, and criticised heavily for it, which I don't understand, and Lisa, you and I have talked about it throughout this morning.
The only thing that people are perhaps a little more rightly criticizing is that Jay Powell and Janet Yellen seem to have a slightly different tone in terms of all deposits are basically guaranteed versus we have emergency measures that we can take and we'll come out and we'll make them. Are they different kinds of comments? You can parse out the questions, but there is an issue of anything that can really be done has to come from Congress, and there isn't really the will to do it in Congress.
So what was the purpose of Congress asking these questions of her this week? What were they trying to do? What were they trying to achieve? Signal?
Are you setting me up?
No, I'm just asking.
They're basically trying to say we're on top of it, but we don't want to take legislative action because that could set us up for a political liability. I'm not wrong.
So why didn't you just say that back?
That wouldn't fly well.
As far as I understand it, so far, to the best of my knowledge, it's up to you to legislate to change the cap on deposits.
Because then she's setting a signal that the banking system needs that, right? So this is she's caught between 2 very difficult decisions. How does she come out? She tried this the first day, it didn't work, and saying totally resilient. We don't need to do anything more. We can step in potentially if there's a problem, but we're not discussing major measures because everything's fine. Didn't work. Stocks tanked, and then the next day she comes out and they say, okay, well, how about now? Eat 2, Brutus, and she's like, well, things.
Go back 2 weekends. Go back 2 weekends. There were banks that some people outside of this country had never heard of before that failed, and they used the systemic risk exception to make those depositors whole. How small do you think the bank would have to be? How irrelevant do you think the financial institution would need to be at this point, in this very febrile moment, for it not to be given the systemic risk exception?
That's a fair point.
My question is ultimately there is so much she's implying here. There's so much information implied through what she's saying that is ultimately we're going to be there again to do the same thing and make depositors whole. Because at this point you'd have to imagine that any financial institution that they just let fail and didn't make depositors whole would have some degree of contagion risk associated with it.
The problem is there's going to be a cost associated with that, so that continues to make stock investors nervous, and you're not solving the ultimate problem, which is a mismatch in the duration of the assets and the liabilities of some of these smaller banks that have more volatile deposits and more concentrated deposit bases. So if you're not solving the problem, then she cannot talk her way out of this, and it's not her problem to talk her way out of. It is ultimately something that lies with
We're on the
Congress.
same page. Like I said earlier, give it a few more days and our hold to maturity portfolio will no longer be underwater because this bond market rally rip-roaring and fast. The 2-year yield's down 19 basis points, 364. The 10-year down 11, we're at 331. Equity softer this morning, down 8 or 9 tenths of 1% on the S&P 500. And the euro, even with some hawkish central bank talk from the German central bank governor, the euro is still weaker. Euro dollar negative, 9 tenths of 1%. The euro against the dollar, 107.39. Joining us now from DC, Anne-Marie. AMH, what more can Secretary Yellen say?
Well, I think what the strategy is going to be is that she doesn't say anymore. Yesterday was a cleanup, clearly for the markets, but also for Congress. It really throws this idea of the FDIC insurance limit and that cap in their hands. And I think that's what Secretary Yellen was trying to say on Wednesday in her Q&A when she was asked about this. And she said, we have not discussed this blanket approach to FDIC, insurance, cat depositor insurance, because that is in the hands of legislators, that is lawmakers. But the markets obviously tanked, so yesterday she wanted to make sure that she put the markets well aware that if there was a systemic emergency need for this, this is something that they could step in. And I think for now, that's all we're going to hear from the Treasury Secretary at the moment. But of course, if there is going to be more contagion, they have to step in. There will likely be more statements from either Yellen or Fed Chair Jay Powell.
Perhaps we're talking too much about Janet Yellen, and really the interest lies in what was not discussed yesterday in that hearing, or the lack of questions really around deposit insurance. Mostly people were curious about the budget and the debt default ceiling and things of this nature. What kind of signal do you take from that in terms of the willingness of Congress members to take any action on deposits, especially given that there are political liabilities around that?
So when it comes to the deposits, when I speak to congressmen and women, all they keep saying, and senators, is that they want to see all the details first. And they don't just want to shoot at the hip because there was a crisis and react. So next week, there's going to be a ton of hearings. And you're going to have regulators on the Hill. They've also invited bank executives on the Hill of these failed banks. And I think after that, you potentially will maybe see momentum in if Congress is going to raise the cap. Like Senator Elizabeth Warren said, like Congressman Boyle said to us last night, they don't know a number yet, but potentially north of $250,000 could be lifted. When it comes to the debt ceiling, this is actually starting to heat up a little bit because we heard from the Republican budget chair, and they said that they are ready to go to the White House with what is called a debt sheet, not a cheat sheet, a debt limit sheet. I'm basically telling the Biden administration and the House Republicans, these are the demands we have in order to sign up to raise the debt ceiling. But one thing is key there. The White House has said they want to see the Republican budget. That's not going to make it by April 15th. So they're trying to go with this minimum sheet to the White House and say, these are our demands. Can we start negotiations? But it's finally the first time since McCarthy and Biden spoke on February 1st that we are seeing an inch towards potential discussions on debt ceiling talks.
How did talks go with Trudeau? What was that about?
Well, he's still there. The president is in Canada. He's in Ottawa. Josh Wingrove is traveling with him. They are discussing potentially asylum seekers and a deal on that. They're also going to be discussing things like the war in Ukraine, Canada's efforts to support the U.S. and other allies. This is really just a normal stop for the president. You always have to visit your neighbor to the north. I wouldn't expect a lot of news, but it comes at a great time for Biden. If you notice, he hasn't been out front.
We just called the team up north.
What's going on in the markets? He's left that to his Treasury Secretary. Obviously, Fed Chair Jay Powell talked about it this week. Biden has really, he's been talking with celebrities. Bruce Springsteen was there this week. Ted Lasso is there this week. He's in Canada. And when he comes back, him and his administration are going on a 20-state tour to pitch the legislative success they've had the prior 2 years. All of this, obviously, as he gears up to announce for 2024.
So you're saying the president at the moment is in campaign mode?
I would say at the moment it's partially campaign mode and also pointing the finger at Congress, pointing the finger at bank executives, and letting his cabinet members and like Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and also the likes of Lael Brainerd, the head of the NEC now, Jeff Zients, his chief of staff, letting them deal with the market fallout and not getting the president in front of reporters or cameras to talk about it. This could be also because they don't want to spark more fear and risk. If the president really is concerned and starts talking about it, then that's quite probably a little bit of nervous jitters for the market as well.
MH, thank you. Anne-Marie, down in Washington, D.C. There's two ways of looking at this, Lisa. One is that another way is that he's just leaving as Treasury Secretary hanging out to dry. That's one way. Another, to Anne-Marie's point, they're damned if they do and damned if they don't right now. If you see the president on your screens every day talking about banking crisis in America, it's probably not what you want to hear from the president every single day when you're trying to let this settle down, is it?
No, and I think that's the reason why they haven't really come out with the same kind of, we're proposing emergency measures, this is a serious issue. They're trying to do that, but behind the scenes. And that's the reason why people are looking at the data, looking at how much money still is being lent out to banks and saying, it isn't all clear yet.
Ted Lasso. Is that why Tom's off? Just honestly, finally just understood why he's off.
Because he's down there fanboying over Ted Lasso.
Binging Ted Lasso. Is that season out? I haven't watched any of it yet.
He's doing it alongside President Biden.
Did they drop the whole season all at once?
I don't know.
I don't think I
get
watch it this weekend.
BritBox.
BritBox. What's BritBox?
Like British television.
BritBox. Nice.
The state has spent about $20 billion in the last roughly 5 years, and the count of people has increased significantly.
Oh, Stop nothing gas station. Ever since I left the city, you. Remember this one? Good. I can't come on, bidding. Earthport, baby. Straight cat by Marco.
So what's the best investment advice you've ever been given by anybody? The compound interest, the compounding of returns is an incredible miracle of business, finance, and human existence. Everything you learn is additive every day.
Well, looks like you're fine. See you, kid.
Incredible miracle, and it's not just interest. It was always said about compound interest, compound business, compound human returns. They're all very additive. In your observation of investors, what do you think is the biggest mistake that average investors make selling?
Dude, I'd be like, Jerome Powell, you better start flipping burger to McDonald's and get us out of this fucking recession. I don't even know how to do that, but
if they invest for the right
Mr.
reason,
Speedy,
just keep at it.
the Speedy system's gonna do it. You're fucked up.
A lot's happening on Wall Street.
Agricultural model.
Need to catch up?
Put away.
I'm David West. We've got the information and insights
A lot of these areas still have very, very good valuations.
from businesses most influential and instrumental.
Knocking it out of the ballpark.
George, I like how it kept going. Go down. Look at this one, George. That's why. That thing's being a bitch.
Tonight with replays all weekend on Bloomberg
God.
Television and Radio.
Hey, what? Tell me I'm so
Is this show available on BritBox?
I'm not sure. It depends on whether Tom. I think that Tom would actually make it more like BritBox than you.
Tom probably would, yeah.
This bitch, Abramovich, is gonna get masturbated to
Basically,
like
every
1,000 times. She won the fucking. She won the fucking
Isn't it so much
lottery.
better?
Why? Because she's on this fucking bitch. Nobody watches
But no,
Bloomberg.
seriously, like John.
When's the last
isn't it
motherfucking
so
time
much
you heard
better
anybody
over
say that
at
motherfucker's name?
They
when
ask
he's
me that
running for
question all the
president?
time.
Fuck you.
The reason he asked me
Are
that
you
question is
done?
to try and get me to offend Americans, which is why he always asks the question, because he hopes that one day I'll just go home. That's not happening. Go ahead. New York right now. Good morning. Equity futures negative 0.75% on the S&P 500. We're a bit softer, lighter, lower negative. Big moves in the bond market, so let's discuss them. 2 year earlier, sub 360. Right now, let's call it 365. Still moving up aggressively, so by 18 basis points. On a 10 year, we're down about 11 or 12 basis points. 330, 331 on a 10 year. This whole curve is gravitating towards 3% at the moment. I don't know what's going to disrupt that trend. This is basically the trade that Bob Michael at JP Morgan Asset Management was pushing. He said the whole curve, 2s out to 30, is going to drop to 3.00%. Who am I to argue with him? We're only about 30 basis points away on a 10 year. Outside of that, in the FX market, the German central bank governor is saying, let's go, there's more to do. And in Q3, I'd like to speed up QT. And then the euro starts dropping. Euro dollar 107.45, negative 0.8%. It's a real turn in risk, I would say, like the last, let's call it 2 hours, Lisa, where equities kind of fell out of bed. The dollar ripped. The front end of this curve really started to rally quite hard.
I don't like giving a narrative to this because it's impossible and we've made it to look foolish pretty quickly. I do wonder how much is technical in terms of unwinds that are going on because it's hard to explain the underpinnings of some of the names that really have driven some of this that really is in the bank complex, particularly over in Europe. Deutsche Bank, I'm looking at the ADRs right now, the American Depository Receipts, and they're down more than 10%. Why? I don't know. Pick your narrative, pick your reason, but we're not necessarily seeing it. Similar with UBS, those shares down not as much as Deutsche Bank, and perhaps there's more of a rationale, but you saw the turn lower, John, to your point, only recently accelerating with losses. Both of these shares near session lows, those shares down more than 5%. And this is bleeding back into the regionals in the U.S. I'm looking at PacWest and I'm looking at Western Alliance, not First Republic, but some of the other shares of banks that have come under pressure in the United States. PacWest shares since March 8th are down 65%, and Western Alliance shares down 56%. Massive, and it just continues at a time where there isn't a sense of what's going to pack the fear that some people have been perpetuating.
Everything we've talked about all morning, and the biggest amount of feedback I've had, obviously, is over Ted Lasso. Everyone wants me to know it's an episode by episode. Season 3 is out. It's a commercial. I knew that already. I just didn't know whether it was all at once. I just couldn't remember. So I never watched season 1 when it was coming out. I watched it after it was already out. So I binged that. I wasn't that impressed with season 2. I've got to be honest with you. We'll see what's in store for season 3. I'm sure everyone's got an opinion. Everyone's got an opinion.
I think I should get ripost. I think I should. Yeah, I think so. I think
we're going to watch Coronation Street.
I think I'm going to watch some soap operas.
You should.
You know, basically, you know, it'll bleed out to the show as we
switch off and relax.
Just watch British soap operas.
Other people's problems. You know, not your own.
Thank you. I like
Deborah
that.
Cunningham, Global Liquidity Markets CIO at Federated Hermes, joins us now. Deborah, this move in the bond market is just a monster move. This 2 year, to see the yield down another 18 basis points. I know we've got used to moves like this, Deborah, but it's not usual. It's unusual to see the bond market move the way it has done over the last couple of years, Deborah. What do you think it signals?
You know, I think it signals that there's unrest and unsurety in the economy. So, you know, over the course of the last 2 weeks, if you look at, you know, sort of Fed funds futures, we've gone from, you know, prior to the regional banking issues here in the U.S., expecting a terminal rate of 570, you know, all the way down to expecting a terminal rate of 460, and you know, now kind of back up in the 510 area based on the FOMC meeting this week. But I think there's no conviction. People see, you know, different statistics being reported from an economic standpoint, whether they're inflation, retail sales, any number of statistics, and then they see stories about Credit Suisse, stories about Silicon Valley Bank, the bank term funding program.
This guy begged to be in the Reddit investor card, and then he started masturbating online.
What the last information was that you saw, and it's driving the market on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour basis up and down.
Deborah, yesterday afternoon, the investment company Institute came out with data on total inflows into money market funds in the U.S. over the past week. And just looking at this, it's been the biggest 2-week increase in money market 2008 financial crisis time period. I think
those were driven by mostly fear. And basically people were leaving the risk markets, the equity market, the longer term fixed income market, and they were being driven into deposits and money market funds. For this one, I think there's money coming out of deposits. Maybe it started from a fear perspective way back 2 weeks ago. It seems like it could have been, 2 months ago at least, but it's only 2 weeks with the issues surrounding Silicon Valley Bank and Signature. And ultimately, I think what that did is cause people to look at where their short-term liquidity is, and a lot of it is in uninsured deposits or in insured deposits, but with very, very low rates, 75 basis points, 1%. And then when you look at a money market fund, you look at something that's giving you 4.5%, climbing towards 5%, with a lot of diversification and much higher credit quality than what a bank loan portfolio would give you, which is what typically would be backing bank deposits. So I think it's a little bit different as to the origin of this cash for this time versus what it was in 2020 and 2008.
So is it not reflected necessarily in what your clients are doing, what they want to see in terms of positioning of their assets? Have you not seen the same degree of inflows that you would expect at a time of a mass rush into money market funds?
Well, we have. We've seen a huge amount coming in to our liquidity products and to our money market fund products, and very much reflective of the information that the ICI has provided. Very much reflective of Crane data. Money market assets are at all-time highs, but we're not seeing it go out of our equity and longer-term fixed income products. Instead, what we're seeing is, deposits of banks down, over the course of the last 2 years, $2 trillion, and on a week-over-week basis, the most recent data showing that continue to decline. So I think it's coming out of other liquidity products that are just much lower in yield, and given what happened with Silicon Valley and Signature Bank, I think reflective of diversification in the liquidity markets into money market funds from those deposits.
Is this a problem that can be solved with rate cuts?
Well, I think it's something that ultimately could get you back to zero if there were truly a crisis, but I don't believe we have a banking crisis. And so simply cutting rates, by 50 or 100 basis points, as the Fed projections say they might do in 2024 and 2025, isn't going to change it much, because bank deposit rates lag interest rates going up, but are sticky with interest rates going down. So I don't think you're going to see, first of all, I don't think you're going to see a return to zero. We're not in that type of a situation. Bank balance sheets are very healthy. There's lots of equity, lots of healthiness in the bank market. And I think that, minor cuts that might come in 2024 or 2025 are not something that's going to see parity again in that sector for a little while.
Deborah, what do you suppose is more important to this Fed? What a rate cut would achieve, or what a rate cut would signal?
I think what a rate cut would signal. I think they see very little from an achievement perspective, and I think they got a little bit of cover, if you will, from what the ECB did last week with 50 basis point rate increase and no huge ramifications that came from that. And they even had, they were dealing with a larger issue with Credit Suisse. So I feel like that gave the Fed a little bit of cover to increase rates this week, 25 basis points, and I think that's exactly the signal that they wanted to provide. They are still fighting inflation. They are still on their, dealing with their core mandate. They are not fighting some sort of financial crisis here in the U.S.
Deborah Cunningham, Federated Hermes. Deborah, thank you. To some point, to some extent, Lisa, let's explore this. The Fed get themselves in a bit of a bind here. They basically told us that the financial stress, difficulties, instability, pick your word, whatever, of the last 2 weeks is a substitute for hikes to some extent. It might have put a number on that of about 50 basis points. So let's say it's 50 basis points over the last few weeks. Let's say it gets worse. We're in and around where the median dot is right now, 5.1% for 2023. If it gets worse, wouldn't it make sense to reduce interest rates? Because you're saying that a financial stability is a substitute for rate hikes. And if you think you're very close to what you think is going to be sufficiently restrictive, isn't some form of adjustment required.
This is the logic that's underpinning perhaps the move that we're seeing.
Oh,
The question is, if you still see data that comes in, if you still see that consumers are spending, although it is softening, as the credit card survey show, then how do you diverge from what you said 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, which was inflation is the number one concern, not we want to make sure the banks are okay. So before you get the data showing how much lending is being constricted at some of these banks that are losing all those deposits that we were just hearing about, how do you justify that with a consistent message?
It's the fear of what you'll signal. And I think that's the issue with Fed policy at the moment, is the obsession with what you're going to signal if you did start to adjust interest rates. The other difficulty I have, and I was discussing this with David Bianco of DWS yesterday, is that you can reduce rates but still have monetary policy that is tight, particularly if you have financial stability concerns continuing and lending standards tighten. So this idea that the Fed's backing away from rate hikes and that's being a good thing, look, you have to think about it this way. It's important. If we had the SCP 2 weeks ago, that median dot was coming up to 550. The fact they left it at 5.1 on top of the financial instability we've had over the last 2 weeks, I don't think that's dovish. I don't think that's dovish at all. They're saying they're putting a number on it.
It's rocking out a chick with a mustache.
This is worth 50. Instead 5.1.
It's not particularly encouraging to think that
if anybody
banks
wants to know in our family,
deposits and cannot make
comes in
loans,
bronze,
given
really,
how much that was a driver of growth.
Oh my god, that makes more important.
This isn't enough. You're going to have to cut loads. And it could get worse.
What in the fuck was that?
In the equity markets, we're resilient over the last couple of
Give
weeks.
me all this fucking timeline. Where is the world where this bitch is? She's up here looking like Lionel Richie, and I'm over here like, what the fuck?
Running through the storm.
We use the coffee on my cell
Trace is going to join us from Vader Partners.
They not
talking a whole lot more.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Lisa Mateo. UBS and Credit Suisse are among the banks being looked at by the U.S.
Look at
Justice
this one.
Department
Look, tell everybody the story. You guys be like, oh, well, look at my account over here. Anyway, like this.
Subpoenas also went to employees of some major U.S. banks. Credit Suisse and UBS both declined to comment. The CEO of Standard Chartered says the worst moments of the banking crisis are over. Bill Winters spoke to Bloomberg's David Ingles in Hong Kong.
Do you speak English? Hey, do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? Are you done? Ever since I left the city.
Models of the companies that have had trouble that need to be addressed at this point. But it certainly seems that the acute phase of the crisis is done.
When asked if he would be willing to buy any of Credit Suisse's assets, Winter said Standard Chartered is always interested in looking at things with a decent return. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
Really, that's true. Espresso virtuoso, good thing. Really?
We're investing a lot in a lot of different capabilities, features that makes the in-store shopping experience
Espresso
that much
virtual.
easier, that much
Oh,
more
okay.
compelling, whether it's price check,
Yeah, yes, they call
browsing
me
in
on
store, in the
myself.
store, so that we can really make that experience as
Green
convenient.
marzipan.
Convenient, simple. That's sort of what people have needed in the age of
Marzipan's a
COVID.
big thing.
Is that
But yeah,
here
they
to
didn't make
stay, or do
marzipan
we go back
taste
when finally we all
No,
hope
you
that
didn't.
the pandemic will be behind us in some way? Do our changing shopping habits go back again?
What's really interesting about retail in my 20 plus experience is that convenience never reverts itself. Now, the
following me,
form of
dog.
convenience has
Oh,
shifted.
God.
There is, say,
Alan?
in 2000, 2010, a lot of convenience was driven by more stores nearby. Now it's stores in addition to digital. There's nothing closer than the phone in your hand.
Abitability. That was so sick. Say it again, Mikey. Oh, abitability? Oh,
You've got to explain this one to me.
Hell yeah.
What does it mean when the White House says we're watching markets carefully? It means they have I've seen the Bloomberg. I've been in and seen it.
I'm on YouTube this shit, unless
I've seen the Bloomberg. I've seen the Bloomberg.
and then I retweeted it. That was sick.
What does it
The other
mean?
shit was like, oh, never mind, he retweeted this other person who retweeted him. It was like a retweet of a retweet. What if that person retweeted and you retweeted?
The top names in business
Oh,
are on Bloomberg.
We'll see a future where
it's like, oh my god,
One day, maybe, but it's very possible it won't happen in our lifetime. Nobody covers business like Bloomberg.
yeah, but shit, yeah, this shit is yo, remember the best thing is, oh dog, you're so sick. Look at the media. Oh, you want to look at my media? So you can see how hot I am?
has ideas spied on American citizens. I don't think that spying is the right way to describe it. No, ultimately, we could differ on this. This is ultimately an internal investigation. Face, palm, really hard, just brutal. I don't think spying is the right way to describe it. I thought his performance yesterday was super polished. Said a few times already this morning. Very slick guy. That was a tough moment, a really tough moment.
They were looking for one slip up and they got one. And it's not necessarily substantive necessarily. We don't know. But the bottom line is there's an impression that the Chinese government could get access to the data that is collected by TikTok at any time that they wish. And he was not able to allay those fears in the way that these politicians would have liked. Not that they would have had those fears allayed anyway, regardless of what he said.
That exchange has ByteDance spied on American citizens. I don't think the spying is the right way to describe it. I could play that all day. That's just insane.
That's the one I want.
Anyone asks you that, the answer is no. And then you can say whatever you want, but you answer very directly so that the soundbite captures.
But he wasn't able to say no. He said that instead.
Right.
What kind of questions or concerns does that raise?
I mean, that's the issue.
How would he describe it?
Collecting data that could be used for lots of other purposes. Yeah, but what's the distinction between TikTok and other social media companies?
Oh, it's a massive one.
And this is one distinction, and it's just one
monster distinction,
which is
Facebook's not there.
Well, is that the issue, or is it that the Chinese government has also shown recently that they're more willing to encroach on business government divide, and they always have been?
Why isn't Facebook there? Because the concerns the Chinese government has about foreign tech is exactly the same concerns the US has about tech coming out of China right now. You know, this goes back to, I used this word earlier, reciprocity. I'm not sure what happened to that conversation. Why are we talking about that a whole lot more?
At what point, though, does that stretch into Apple? Does that stretch into all of the big tech companies that have substantial businesses in China, regardless of what IP or what other types of security issues could get breached?
True. Henrietta Trace joins us now, the managing partner and director of economic research at Veda Partners. What a moment, Henrietta. I wouldn't describe it that way. I don't think spying is the right way to describe it. What were your thoughts when you heard that?
Please stop. I mean, that was so terrible to watch. That was really tough. And it was definitely one of the most aggressive hearings that I can remember watching. And I've seen quite a few of them. But I agree with your point. I think he did as great of a job as you could have done. And the members knew what they wanted to get out of that moment, out of that 5-hour hearing. And it was, as some of the members were saying, the most bipartisan committee and most bipartisan hearing that we've seen in a very long time. And I think that is really what drove the attention yesterday. And they got the stuff that they wanted, as you pointed out, Lisa.
Well, but Henrietta, how quickly can they actually get something done? Where is the actual political will to do something that could make some serious ripple effects, particularly among younger Americans?
I'm really glad you asked. I don't think that there will be material legislation targeting TikTok specifically. I do not think that there will be a national ban. I understand that yesterday's hearing was very explosive, got a lot of attention. It was the banner headline across all media platforms yesterday. But the Congress is not in a position to pass legislation to ban TikTok right now, even constitutionally if they could. What I think is happening, and I would encourage investors to do, is watch Catherine Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative, today when she's up on the Hill for the second hearing in front of the House Ways and Means Committee. That's where you're writing a big, comprehensive China bill. And we saw her do a preview of that yesterday at Senate Finance. They were dueling hearings at the exact same time. But if you didn't want to watch fireworks and you were more interested in policy, you would have watched the Senate Finance hearing. That's what I was doing. So I would encourage people to watch Catherine after Thai today, investor Thai at 9 a.m. because they have issues about China's expansion into Latin America, Brazil, Russia, IP theft, human rights, climate issues. This is the TikTok issue is one that effectively brings everybody to the yard, gets that bipartisan support we're looking for, and allows them to craft a comprehensive China bill, which the Biden administration is hoping to do after the debt ceiling standoff is resolved, or worst case scenario in his next term if he gets reelected.
When it comes to the consequences of this, how much are you watching TikTok and how much are you watching Apple and other big tech companies that have substantial businesses over in China?
This is exactly what's in the Restrict Act. That is the one bill that I do think could pass on TikTok. It's really about all emerging technologies, all social media. And it doesn't just target China, it also targets Iran, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba. It's the most comprehensive, and it could theoretically put every social media company on the front of the table and allow the Department of Commerce, obviously run by an extraordinarily competent Secretary Raimondo, to see what they want to do, study the issue, and then restrict and ban if they see fit.
The TikTok CEO had a tough day. Secretary Yellen has had a tough 2 weeks. Henrietta, let's talk about policy. Where is this? Policy effort going on the banking front?
Nowhere fast.
That ice cream looks like dog shit.
I have spoken with Democrats and Republicans, House, Senate, for the last past 2 weeks or 2 years, however it's been since SVB collapsed. The reality on Capitol Hill is that the House Republican Conference is not prepared to move legislation on banking at this time. There are many ideas floating around, but there is no path to 218 votes from a majority of the Republican Conference in the House on any legislation. And what I hear time and time again is that you need to see the impact of this banking crisis and the collapse of a couple sort of bespoke boutique firms, which is how a lot of House Republicans think about this, really start to hit the heartland. You need to see farming banks, farming state impacts. It can't just be commercial real estate that is reeling from during the Great Recession, and they were not here during the banking collapse, and many of them ran on the campaign of we are against bailouts, we're against TARP. And when they look at ensuring all deposits and passing legislation to hike the $250,000 cap, all they see is bailout. That's not going to pass in this one.
Do you see, can you identify a mechanism for the Treasury to move forward and temporarily suspend the limit on deposits? Is there a mechanism that exists in your mind?
Yes, absolutely. And one thing that I recall, I was in the Senate during the banking crisis, the ability of regulators to act is unparalleled, and the things that they can pull out of the hat are really impressive. So I think the most focus right now, I've spoken with Senate Banking Committee staff on, that I know Treasury is working on, is shoring up all the things that we would think of for extraordinary measures on the debt ceiling. I would encourage folks to look at Secretary Geithner's letter sent back in 2012, where he lays out like 5 different baskets of funding that the Treasury has exclusive authority over that they can tap into in the event of a crisis. This circumstance I'm referencing was the debt ceiling, but they can use that here as well. The ESG fund in particular is getting a lot of attention. Treasury Secretary Yellen, once President Biden gives her the sign-off, is authorized to use the funds there, which were $216 billion as of January 31st of this year, to deploy as she sees fit. So I think that's where a lot of the focus should be. It's on the regulators. Importantly, I think the regulators know that Congress is incapable of action, and so they are already prepared to move, and they have experience if the members of the House do that.
Just to finish on Secretary Yellen, she was asked whether she'd discussed some of these issues, and she said she hadn't discussed them, and I struggled to believe that, Henrietta, just struggled to believe that the Treasury hadn't had a discussion about doing away with the cap on deposit insurance through the mechanisms with which you've identified. Were you surprised that she used that language?
I do think that there's been some maybe back and forth in terms of what they're telegraphing, but I also get the sense that Treasury's trying to exude calm and stress, as the Federal Reserve helped them do earlier this week, that there's not a systemic banking crisis. So I do think that acting unilaterally to, provide unlimited backstop would have gotten a lot of blowback. She committed to that. Just think about how quickly that sounds like a bailout, especially when you've got guys like Gary Cohn throwing out $10 million numbers. That is just too high. So I do think that there was some strategy involved there, which was the worst scenario. Say that you are considering it on an unlimited basis, or maybe just say, hey, we haven't had that conversation. I think she picked the least bad option.
What a tough spot. I'm going to trace the fader partners. Who would you prefer to be this week, Rabbi? TikTok CEO, secretary ever? Take a pick.
TikTok CEO, because you had nothing to lose. You were already working
Just lose.
Exactly.
Just lose. You'd lost already.
Exactly.
Patrick Armstrong, Marumi Wow for coming up.
Welcome back to another Miami Open update for Bloomberg TV and radio from Tennis Channel. I'm Johnny Ray Diaz. Carlos Alcaraz will be the headliner Friday in the Sunshine State. The Spaniard took the title at Indian Wells last week with an impressive straight sets win over Daniil Medvedev, which also took him back to world number one. He faces Argentina's Facundo Bagni in his opener at the Hard Rock Stadium. And don't forget, you can watch all the action exclusively live on Tennis Channel.
Oh, Tennis Channel is huge, dog.
Fixing things that go wrong and smoothing out bumps in the road is what customers expect from energy providers. And for Duke's Renewable Assets, that process is overseen from one room in an office building in Charlotte, North Carolina. Ryan Savoy showed me around the company's Renewable Control Center.
This is where operators are monitoring and managing over 5,000 megawatts of renewables across the United States.
How would this differ from like a conventional assets monitoring center?
Yeah, so assets historically,
Gosh.
monitoring center on site. So you might have an operator with screens, but at the site. Whereas this we could do 90 sites, take offshore wind, onshore wind, solar. And they're looking at the smallest change.
Actually, you got a heavy shirt.
Every megawatt hour is one of these assets isn't producing the full capacity. We're putting another resource on.
Been there, done that, got the t-shirt.
Consistent. As clouds come,
Are you done?
this is by the minute.
Yeah,
This is
right
not
back. Oh, no,
hours
it's
off,
fucked.
now it's by the
I know.
minute. And then
Look, you're not even tired. You're like, I know.
we have assets that follow this.
No shit, look at this one. Oh, no. No shit. Oh my god, you're so sick. You're like, oh my god, look at this. The war, the brave nation. Around with Saddam. Oh, god. No, she was like, oh, cool. Oh, bumble.
As governments, we have a responsibility to create the incentives and the space for you to flourish. A receptive environment for change and the accountability that comes from guardianship.
What up, bro? You heard
In many nations, the foundation for this approach has been laid for us long ago.
Michigan should never have
Listen,
done like
where I come from, Aotearoa, New Zealand, a beautiful place to just visit. Our indigenous people hold the worldview that every single living and non-living thing is connected.
Where's this bitch? Just in the
Our
basket?
plants, our animals,
Just in the
descendants
basket.
of
Just in the
Ranganui
basket.
and nature are kin, are friendly.
You
And
got
we must
basket,
care
honey.
for one another in the spirit of kaitiakitanga, which translates into
Oh, well,
guardianship
it's in the
by
basket.
the people of the land for the next
I'm
generation.
surprised they don't rip into her. So weird.
Studios in New York and
San
San
Francisco.
Francisco. Our new hosts of the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch. Plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde in Ludlow.
Oh, what's in the basket? What's in the basket? No. But what's the thing? It's called like. So,
Only on Bloomberg Television.
power? No. Oh, wait a second.
see in the United States and the UK is disastrous data will show, and central banks will then move into panic mode as the markets are pricing in already.
They've got to show that they can manage both this as well as a crisis and confidence within the regional banks.
Banks are really where the rubber meets the road in terms of taking financial policy and pushing it into the real economy.
As the banking situation hopefully calms down, the data will become more important.
The conversation is going to have to shift, I think, in the next few weeks towards what does the path for the next 1 to 2 years look like.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrell, and Lisa Abramowitz.
I usually start Friday by saying, let's get you to the weekend, but the last 2
Go take it
weekends
by
have
my
not been
wife.
much of a weekend. So we don't want another one. Let's get you to a better weekend.
I think
There
it
you
is
go,
still
this morning. Good
saying
morning. Good
yeah,
morning.
what's her name?
This is Bloomberg Surveillance from
Like,
Audio
I
201
don't know, but I know her
Radio.
parents owned a
Next week,
shoe
she's
store,
down about 8 or 9
and it would
tenths
be
of
really
1%.
big, like a
A
rummage
couple of names to
store.
stay on top
Yeah.
of this morning.
I don't
Deutsche
remember
Bank
her
is
name.
one down 14%. UBS right now, Lisa, down
Really? Yeah, did you ever think for it?
6.7%. First Republic was a little bit softer earlier. I'd call that unchanged on my screen relative to what we have seen over the
We used
last
to hang
2
out.
weeks.
I would agree
Really?
with those shares still trading with a
Yeah, but
12
what is that
handle in
bitch's
terms
name?
of how much they've fallen. If you take a look at some of the
I'm
other,
really
other
excited
regional
for
bank
the
stocks in the U.S.,
hang
also under pressure,
Really?
whether
Yeah.
it's PacWest or whether it's Western
It was during
Alliance.
the game.
Why?
I've
Right?
seen it
What
years.
happened,
Really?
John, to
Yeah,
really
she's
trigger
freshman.
ongoing
So
selling?
it's
And this
like,
is
what
the
the matter?
difficulty right
What the
now
fuck
that
is
we're
that gonna
having is we don't have a sense of where the risks lie, but the tea leaves, whether it's balance sheets or other data, highlight that there's still enough stress that banks are borrowing from
How
federal
about the other one?
authorities.
Well, let's talk about
Funny
the
couple
stress.
things.
Push it
They're
through
like
the bond
mom
market when you have
and Mary
stress, and push it through bonds. Get a big rally. 2-year yield down 24 basis points, sub 360, Lisa, on the session. Right now, 359. 10-year down 13. Call it 14 basis points. 10-year right now, 329. What a
My
move.
name is
So a month ago,
Jonas.
2 months ago, we were talking about the potential for a 5% Fed funds rate as late as January of next year. Now we're talking
that thing
about a
jump out,
3.5% Fed funds rate as of January next year. There has been a complete repricing in terms of how much the Fed is not going to have to just hike rates or not hike rates, but how much they're going to cut in the face of some of the stress that we're seeing in the banking system. Now, again, officials are not saying that this is the case. And you've asked a
I
really
like
good
how it was
question.
from
You picked up on
94
this
to
and you've
2000, like
asked it again
15
and
years.
again.
They don't
Rate
show
cuts
anything.
good
It's
for
things
risk
like
assets
walking
in an
over
environment
there,
where it
fucking
means
broom,
that the
hockey
economy
stick, and
and
it's
the
like,
credit
oh,
tightening
God,
is doing the work for the Fed.
cool.
Not all rate cuts are created equally. If you had
My name
projected
is
rate cuts
Jonas.
because you believe that we're going to get that immaculate disinflation and the Fed could back away, great stuff. Market should rip. The economy's going to be great. If you're cutting interest rates because things are breaking, I'm not sure things are great just yet. And the people who
Hello,
want to
Jane
blame
Collins.
recovery, I think the point of tension for me and the point of tension that I'm asking a lot of questions about, and Lisa Levine was
You got
great
Collins
earlier
or
this week
Chance
to be a
Steve's now?
one-man
Oh
on
my
this.
God, what's going
She was
on?
talking about
Oh
the
my
trade
God,
after
can
the
you
trade.
baby?
You can't blame the recovery before you actually see the
Get
recession.
your ass out of my
And the
house.
price
Get
action
the
associated
fuck
with
out
it.
of here,
What
kid.
I've seen the biggest change in recently is where people see
Really?
the real yields
Yep.
going
What did my
forward,
father
and it is
ever
much
say?
lower.
You ever
Does
get an
that give you
earring? You're gonna have to
risk
wear
assets? And
pantyhose and
I'm
heels
curious
with
when
it.
people start
Really?
to think,
Yeah, because that's
okay,
what chicks
if
do,
the Fed
dude.
backs away from rate hikes sooner, does that mean higher inflation for longer? How do we play that trade out if basically the stresses in the financial system have the potential for how
Is that
much this Fed can fight inflation when it still is an issue?
That's the wrinkle
offensive?
in the story.
Yeah.
There is just this
No,
belief
it'd
they'll
be
back
like
away because
the
it is a
United States would be
disinflationary
like
shock.
Washington,
Get rid of the
America,
inflation
dog.
problem. When only
Oh,
a couple of
God,
weeks ago,
that's
people on this
sick.
program
That's
said it was a
fuck.
secular component to the inflation
Yo.
story. It was sticky for
My
longer.
name is
It was hard for
Yoshi.
longer. You're as frustrated as everyone else is with this story. So
My
Nasdaq has just
name
ripped
is
over the last couple of weeks. The S&P right now is at about 1% on the S&P 500. Futures are a whole lot softer here. I'd say the dollar's a whole lot stronger too. The euro, negative 90, big rally in the bond market. Joining us now is Pat, the interesting trade. I know you were short Credit Suisse and you have some of the debt. Let's start there. Walk me through how that worked out.
So I was short Credit Suisse all of last year. I actually closed my short, unfortunately, at the beginning of March. So I covered it as important company bonds couldn't fail. So had a bit of a scary ride over the weekend.
We sure you did.
Some of the bonds I own are senior bonds, all senior bonds, but at the group level. And there were scenarios where if it was a forced asset sale and UBS didn't buy the group,
Hey, Rod.
would have come under pressure, potentially even being worthless. But it turned out to be a good trade on both sides of those. This week's closed Credit Suisse. So we're actually short Bank of Nova Scotia in Canada now. by the same issues that all the other banks plummet in value. I think they're viewed as a beacon of safety, but Canadian banks have a property bubble to deal with, and they've got rising rates to deal with, and they're very expensive. You look at every other bank in the world, and they're trading at fractions of tangible book value. Canada is still trading at multiples of tangible book value, so very expensive banks, very well run banks, but with a property bubble that creates some risk.
Well, let's put some numbers on that property bubble, Patrick. How bad is that situation?
Well, property is always very hard to exactly quantify, but affordability index Canada is right near the bottom of the world. Property prices have gone up 400%. Incomes are rising in line with the rest of the world. So zero interest rate policy that's property price jumps everywhere. It's just really magnified in Canada. Canada has a commodity exporter as well, so in high oil prices, the economy was relatively resilient. And zero interest rate policies have led to incredibly strong property market, especially in the big cities.
Patrick, I'm going to help you out. Disclosure, you're from Canada, right? So this is something coming from a place where you can criticize your own home more easily. I am curious of whether this is just a symptom of liquidity being drawn out of the system that is exposing other areas as overly inflated that have not gotten repriced down, where you see a potential trade.
Well, it's a combination with Bank Nova Scotia, expensive versus other banks. Very high on book value, higher on earnings, and you are going to see impairments on its loan book because banks, their business model is you lend money to people to buy houses. If those house prices come back to normal on any measure versus history, you're going to have bad debt in Canada.
But it's not just a Canadian story. I mean, aside from just real estate, and there are issues or pockets of issues in the Scandinavian countries and other areas where there also is an affordability problem. It's also private equity. It's also private debt. We have seen this. We've heard this from a number of different people. And then others push back and say, well, it's either repriced or it won't have to reprice because the assets will return to their value later on. Do you think that that's fair? Or do you think that there are pockets, notes of potential contagion? Should there be some forced sales, some price discovery in some of these assets?
Yeah, private equity investors are generally not forced into sales, but if you mark the market properly, there's no way private equity dodged to sell off in treasuries, to sell off in equities, to sell off in every asset in 2022. But private equity funds mark their assets down 6%, some of them things like that, but those aren't realizable levels. So I'm actually, I don't want to talk about stocks, but I'm short EQT, which is a private equity, a lot of private equity assets. I'm short SoftBank, which was a play on higher interest rates and companies that have no path to profitability. But it is also tying into what you just said about marking to market versus marking to what you want to market at.
So Patrick, tell me about the longs, since you don't want to talk about the shorts too much anymore. What's your favourite long right now?
My long, I like PPA. If we're talking about banks, especially, that's a company that's going to grow its revenue probably 15% minimum this year. Their interest rates aren't zero anymore. That's a big headwind to their profitability. So I'm not anti-bank. I think some of the banks make sense. I like to pair longs with shorts. BBVA, I think, is very attractive value right now.
The ECB's coming out swinging, talking about more hikes. You heard the German central bank governor saying the same thing, maybe even speeding up QT in 3Q. You think that's achievable?
Well, you've got to measure price stability, which they're worried about, but financial stability, I think, is first and foremost in all the central banks are to be right now. And I actually think we probably aren't going to get as hawkish responses we probably would have otherwise. And it's going to sow the seeds for interest rates down the line because central banks playbook when there is financial stress, throw liquidity at it. And you've got conditions tightening that are offset by the liquidity they're throwing right now. So it's not inflationary right now, but they have a tendency to leave those policies in place a little bit longer than they should. So I think inflation is really dying out quick right now, but I think it's probably got another leg up in response to what's going to be happening from central banks in the coming months.
What's the growth profile associated with that inflation call, Patrick?
So I think the U.S. is probably going to fall into a technical recession, probably just based on the tighter financial conditions. less access to credit. My view was a month ago it wouldn't. My view is now that it probably will, but I think it's going to be relatively minor. The employment situation is still robust. Employment's always a lagging indicator, but 1.6 job openings for every unemployed person, that's going to change a lot before you see a meaningful disruption to the U.S.
Who knows?
That's very fascinating
Oh,
to
so
catch
you're
up.
gonna like that.
Very cool on Credit Suisse
Did
as
you
well.
like
Patrick
that?
Armstrong
No,
there.
I just
Overcoming your wealth. I'm sure he hoped he'd held on for another 2 weeks
Yeah.
onto that short, but 70% move.
Yeah.
That's
Watching
what growth profile is associated with that kind of inflation over the longer term and that increase you might see in stimulus. A lot of people calling for stagflation.
Can we put the stagflation?
And that's, I think, where a lot of people are concerned about where do you go if you have that kind of environment. If basically central banks are forced to throw money at a problem that really is driven by the financial system, and then it leaves us back to square one